So, Eric, some might listen to this episode on meal timing, meal frequency. We talk about TRE. We talk about a lot of things. You'll understand what that means probably midway point through this episode. But really, we made some new friends, and that's what's most important. You know, Ed Cohen actually said that, and this is a true story when he was interviewed. You're like, oh, wow, you're one of the greatest powerlifters of all time, arguably maybe the greatest. Like, what do you remember most, or what are your fondest memories? And he said, it's not the numbers, it's the friends I made along the way. And I'm pleased to announce, not that we need a bodyguard, because let's face it, no one wants to challenge us. That's the whole idea of the Masculinity in Crisis Tour. We are at the apex. But if one should be foolish enough to want to, well, we just found our new bodyguard here of the cult.
That's right. He looks the part.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting boxing specific surgeries to show that he's been in the ring. That's not even a proverbial statement. That's a truth. Yeah, we've got one of three guests who is a non-returning guest. He is PhD candidate Jackson Pios, working out of University of Western Australia in Perth. He is doing some of, I would argue, of course I am biased being involved in this research. He is doing what I would say some of the most well-conducted and I think the first, when he actually started the project, research on diet breaks in athletes with multiple metrics. A lot of this stuff is going to be coming out soon. It's in peer review. I'm excited for it. But he is, just a brilliant guy, and I'm really glad to have him on. He's, I would say, one of the experts in this topic specifically. But he's not the only one on. We have returning guests, Danny Lennon of Sigma Nutrition, and we have returning recent guest, Dr. Grant Tinsley from Texas Tech University. Danny is a host of Sigma Nutrition. He's had many guests on who've talked about various topics, but one of the areas that he's especially well read in, and he's also played with it in his practice as a nutrition coach for combat athletes and just a nutrition coach in general, is playing with different forms of cyclical distribution of carbohydrates and also different feeding windows. He was last on to talk about chronobiology with us. Before that, he was on with Cliff Harvey to talk about carbohydrates. So both the peri-workout and chrononutrition spaces, he is a very qualified expert to be talking about this stuff. And then for those who don't know, Grant Tinsley, not a one-trick pony. In fact, not even a pony. He's a workhorse, not a one-trick workhorse. He's a two-trick workhorse, folks. He knows all about body composition, but he also knows all about time-restricted feeding. And he's done some of, I would say, the most impactful, and he's probably most well-published in this specific area of having energy restriction in resistance-trained individuals accomplished via time-restricted feeding windows. So if you wanted a panel on meal timing, meal frequency, calorie distribution, this is it. And there is nothing better than this. There never will be unless we do a follow-up.
That's what I want to hear, Eric. And no, just to echo what you said, this is a monster episode. And I like episodes like this because it'll challenge the listener's notions of what is, in quotations, the truth, where you have the short soundbite that you're probably aware of, but we're about to do a whole deep dive. And so just to have these three gentlemen on to talk about this in depth, whew. The only mystery that was left unsolved, Eric, by the end of this was just exactly where Danny was recording from, because everyone else was very verbal, open. You know, Jackson, yes, I'm in West Australia. You know, Grant, Tinseltown, okay, the Tinsel. I'm in America. Danny, he's like, I'm in Philadelphia. I'm not in Philadelphia. Never really further spoke about it. So that's the only mystery. But other than that, all answers, meal timing, meal frequency, answered.
Yeah, I mean, are you Irish? Or do you live in Ireland? Is that your real name? Do you have warrants out for various charges in different places? Don't know. And we won't spend too much time on that because, one, we haven't yet got Jackson on as a bodyguard, and two, not super relevant to this topic, but we would want eventually to broach that topic once we've confirmed with our lawyers and once Jackson is fully signed on to protect our lives. But with that said, to give Danny a compliment, he has a certain cutting edge to his wit. He has a laser-like, dead-eyed focus to him, and I think everyone will appreciate his contributions along with Dr. Tinsley and future Dr. Pios.
Yeah, and just an interesting last tidbit about Danny. No one that's ever disagreed with him has ever disagreed with him twice. They kind of, it seems like they disagree with him, and then you never really hear from them again. So whatever happened, Danny's able to resolve any potential conflicts that he's in or any disagreements. And I think that's just a true market character.
Yeah, for better or for worse, mostly for worse for the other person, he always has the final word.
We haven't even begun, Eric, and I could tell you this is going to be a monster episode. I do want to say something quickly, and that is we got our man, Tinseltown, Grant Tinsley, back in the house so soon after his most recent appearance, because you crushed it. But you'll notice, Eric, that we don't have our boy, Dr. Cody Hahn, on, and that is because there is such a thing as dropping too much science. And for those that tuned in to our episode where we had sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as one of the topics, the last 15 minutes were just a clinic. And we received messages, Eric, that some people had literally their brains explode, kind of like in the Cronenberg movie Scanners, and their parents were very upset. So there is such a thing as too much science, and there's a reason why Tinseltown's back on, and we got this beautiful panel, and Cody is, in the cone of silence.
Yeah, we also got a few messages saying that Grant did such a good job hosting the podcast that we should consider not being on and just having him do a solo. Our ego can't take hits like that, so he will never be back on the cult because he did a good job. So just as a reminder to our 3 current guests, we're looking for a solid B+. But nothing better than that.
Participation awards.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Omar and I have extremely fragile egos, and that's not going to change. So we're not going to up level, so we need to down level everyone else around us.
Push
just
everyone down.
Standard. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
So welcome everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. So I wanted to say this is probably an internet record. And then if anyone knows this to not be the case, don't message us. We have 5 different time zones going on at the same time here. We got Central Time with Tinseltown. We have Danny, who's currently at the is that the 5 Seasons in Ireland? I didn't know they had one there.
This is 4 Seasons Total Landscaping, Philadelphia.
Seasons. Oh, so you're in Philly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a conference center. You
got
may have been there for an event or something.
Right. I thought you were at their Ireland sister corporation, 5 Seasons out.
No. I'm currently here at the original.
Okay. Cool. Good. So we've got you. We'll say you're at you're in Ireland time in your heart. And then finally, we have Jackson Pios just rubbing the crusties out of his eyes, waking up in Western Australia. And then myself in New Zealand, and Omar in Eastern time up in Toronto. So, yeah, we're time travelers, folks. I think that's what that actually means. So for those who don't know, we're going to be talking about all things meal timing, distribution, and frequency. And we have a tremendous lineup. As discussed, we have Dr. Grant Tinsley out of Texas Tech. He has produced some of I'd say the best research, truly the best, type of thing you want to hold a press conference about on time-restricted feeding as of late. He's done work with multiple different feeding windows. We've also got returning guest, and producers have told me that I need to be careful with how I introduce him to avoid any future controversy, but let's just say he has a cutting wit, and he's very knowledgeable on all things chrononutrition, carbohydrates, and meal timing. And we've actually had him discuss that previously on the last podcast that he was on. And then finally, we have my good friend. I want to say you got to be towards the end of your doctoral journey. Am I right, Jackson?
Well, I promise everyone that it's going to finish at some point. It feels like it's an endless pursuit of this PhD, but yes, we are in the closing stages with a number of papers under review at the moment. So my supervisors tell me that it's going to be finished at some point, so keeping the fingers crossed.
All right. So you were in the state that all PhD students get to at a certain point, which is forgetting what it was like to not be doing a PhD and not actually seeing a point in the future when you won't be doing a PhD.
Basically just in a vacuum where sort of time has no meaning, and yes, basically just floating along in the wind like a paper bag.
Ironic, considering your PhD is specifically on the timing of higher and lower calorie intakes, that now time has no meaning. So hopefully you haven't lost your ability to talk about this. But with Hopefully not. All joking aside, it's been a pleasure. For those who don't know, I do have insider information about future Dr. Pios' work. I have had the true privilege and pleasure to be collaborating with him on some of the work coming out of his PhD over the last few years. And he is specifically doing some of the first work on refeeds in athletes. So I should say, diet breaks in athletes. So we're going to uncover what all this means. And I truly think we have a world-class panel today to talk about that. But I think before we get into the science, we have to understand where we are. So Omar, as by far the least educated person in the room, can you give us, you're a man of the people, let's put it that way. And you can tell that I just insulted literally everyone by saying that. Because I'm in the ivory tower. I don't know anything. So I'm on this ivory tower. I pretty much look literally down on the rest of the world. Help me understand, what does everyone think about this stuff?
Well, everyone just says, wow, Eric, what should I do? And they look up at the ivory tower and they're just waiting like a command, almost Old Testament style. There's commandments. And so that's pretty much it. So there's no individual thought. There's a homogeneous level of unthought, so to speak. So that's the scene down here. Back up to you.
Fantastic. So continue to pledge your dying allegiance to us. But I do command you now from the ivory tower. I want you to imagine if you had individual thought and try to give me your best guess at what the masses, if they were individuals, might think about. Sure. Meal timing and frequency.
Yeah. So if I did have indeed free will and individual thought, I would actually go on one of my classic tangents, and I would say, Grant, fantastic to have you here. I thought you did a phenomenal job on the previous episode. Danny, always a pleasure. Chrono Nutrition, my man. Truly one of the episodes that stood out on Iron Culture. And I'm just going to be straight. Jackson, I don't appreciate you being here because you're clearly jacked, even in a webcam where we can only see like 10% of your physique. So you already make myself and Eric uncomfortable, which is why Eric and myself are now vying for the position of second person here that might be the most jacked. And so there's going to be tension in this episode that isn't normally there. We're comfortable usually ruling as a dual dictatorship, two dicks, no taters, as we say on Iron Culture. But you being here, Jackson, I don't know how this episode's going to go. I will do my best now to give a summary. And it's as follows. On the scene, low to the ground, man of the people to the people, something clean, simple, and precise. Okay, to quote one C. Parker. Way back in the day, we're talking now a decade ago, a lot of people might not have been on the boob tube scene, but basically bodybuilders were the ones that were influencing the average person the most in either commercial gyms or through writing via the magazines, telling them what they should do. And there was a lot of what would now be regarded as anachronistic thinking, such as, oh, you need to have a lot of meals. You need to be very frequent with your meals. Protein timing is very important. So you'd hear all these adages that would be just kind of parroted down for the last, let's say, several decades. And this, when I got on the scene maybe a decade ago, that kind of what was holding true. And so you hear things like you need to have meals if you want optimal, your body composition. You want to make sure that you're burning fat at night and, you're also building muscle simultaneously. There were stories of people taking, casein shakes in the nighttime, making sure they spread out an even protein distribution, all these sorts of things. And there's a very exact recommendations, kind of like how also certain foods were essentially vilified and other foods were, exalted up to a higher level where these are the magical foods. So that was a scene before some of the quote unquote evidence-based fitness community started contributing. And then there kind of was that seismic shift, I'd say around 2012. So about 8 years ago, where there were some challengers that were entering the public sphere. Most notably, there may be some forums where there's some jacked individuals, once again, posting pictures of themselves. So we're talking about the bodybuilding.com forums and other areas where people were challenging some of these notions. And so they're saying, do you really need to spread out your meals, 6 times, 8 times per day? Is this necessary? So questioning the validity, the common general assumptions of meal timing. And so there kind of was this seismic shift as then natural bodybuilders started following or started lowering the priority of meal timing in frequency and putting a higher importance placed upon, let's say, total caloric intake, macronutrients, and people having the results. So we had the visual medium now coming up, Instagram, maybe 2013, something like that, where people were getting great results, and you had all those guys with the cringy, IG bios of, how many donuts can I eat and still have a 6-pack abs? And they blew up. And so there was a seismic shift. So people were seeing that maybe meal timing wasn't quite what the old school bodybuilders were saying. But then the third shift that occurred was there's someone, Lean Gains, Martin Birkin, that came on talking about lean gains. How, well, wait a second. Okay, so there was people saying you need 6 to 8 meals in a day. And then there was that seismic shift of is meal timing really that important? And so people started, slamming in those donuts, or like, whatever, man, I had all my protein in 2 servings. What's up, right? Posting with a duck face on Instagram. In comes Martin, and he's talking now about, intermittent fasting. So 16-8 window, so 16 hours of not eating, 8 hours of feeding time, or a 24 window. And so the idea behind that was that, not what he's saying, but as people understood it, is that you can get the same desired results, at least the same desired results. And some people went a step further. You get superior results, even if calories are the same, if you instead change your feeding window. So you had a feeding time and then you had a fasting time. So either 16-8 or 24 or some other such separation. Cool. That's 2014, maybe 2015. There was some segment. Now, after the last several years, there's some people, maybe with some doctorates or whatnot, talking about this meta-analysis, that one, whatnot, that notion that if you're eating the same amount of calories, the same amount of macronutrients, whether you want to split it up into 4 meals, if you want to split up into 3 meals or even 5 meals, that the real world consequences of something that would be significant when it comes to body composition is really not that there. And so for the last 4 years, that's kind of been, if you ask someone that's in the quote unquote evidence-based fitness community, that's what they would say. It's like, yeah, it might have some minor role, but it's not very important. If someone had a pyramid, if there was just a pyramid, if someone could make a neat category and just sell it to the masses and make hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars as their new deity, as set. If someone could put themselves in that role, had the humility to assume the godhead, that they would have then the idea that, yeah, meal timing, it's there, but it's not really that important. And that brings us to 2020. That is the low to the ground opinion. Rob, back to you.
Wow. Well, let me just say, Omar, it's clear that you are at least 1/10 through the way of that 30-hour masterclass, the Greg Nuckols succinct summaries class, because you're crushing it. You gave us a whole lot of information and only took 2 hours, and I think we're ready to actually start the podcast now.
Thank you.
So let's take it back to the ivory tower and make everyone feel bad about the current things they think, because I think that's always a good place to start to get people open-minded and listening. Jackson, I'm going to kick it over to you. And the reason being is we need to establish our terminology. I know this is something that, as you were stuck in the time warp of a PhD, it's something you understand. I remember back when we first met in New Zealand and you were talking about presenting at a conference, and you were like, hey, should I be even calling intermittent fasting? Should I even be calling time-restricted feeding? Because there is this disconnect between the terminology used in the community versus academics. So can you speak to us? Let's define our terms. Help us out here. What are we even talking about?
Yeah, so the funny thing is that there's a lot of disagreement between the researchers and the Gen Pop community, but there's also even disagreements amongst researchers. So you go through a handful of meta-analyses and you'll be able to see that the researchers are referring to these different dietary approaches with different terminologies. So the way that I interpret it, and the way that essentially we interpreted it in our review paper, which we published in 2019 on what we refer to as intermittent dieting, is that we have basically this umbrella term known as intermittent energy restriction. Now, we have basically 2 branches from intermittent energy restriction. On one hand, what we have is intermittent fasting. Now, what we consider to be intermittent fasting, which is not what most of the Gen Pop community believe it to be, is a severe level of intermittent energy restriction that involves complete or near complete restriction of calories on 2 to 3 days per week. Now we're talking either complete abstinence from calories or maybe a maximum of like 500 calories on these days, alternated with ad libitum intake on the other days. Now, the really common forms of intermittent fasting that are often seen in the research is alternate day fasting, or ADF, where you're alternating these severe energy restriction days with ad libitum days across your week. And then we have the 5-2 diet, where you have 2 severely restricted or severe deficit days of your week, and then on the other 5 days, you basically eat ad libitum. Now, generally, almost always, these approaches in the research, when they're prescribed to overweight populations, they almost always result in weight loss. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have what we refer to as intermittent moderate energy restriction. Now, it's kind of a lame term, but that's what we decided to go with. Now, this is a method of intermittent energy restriction as well, but it's more common in physique athletes. So it's alternating a period of moderate energy restriction, like we're talking usually a maximum energy deficit of like 35%, alternated with a period of higher feeding in the form of a refeed or a diet break. Now, that's a very broad definition, but that's sort of the best that we can say at the moment, considering that there are just so many arrangements of the duration of the deficit periods and the duration of the refeed and diet break periods, as well as how much someone consumes during these refeeds and diet breaks and what they're actually consuming. So it's generally agreed upon that energy intake during refeeds and diet breaks should be at least, but not far beyond weight maintenance energy demands, because too little energy is unlikely to cause any restoration in any of the metabolic, hormonal, or psychological parameters, while too much energy is probably going to result in fat gain that would outweigh any potential benefits from the refeed and the diet break itself. Now, finally, we have what the Gen Pop consider to be intermittent fasting, which we actually believe, and the researchers agree to believe, is time-restricted feeding. Now, I believe time-restricted feeding should be a separate entity to intermittent fasting, because while the other dietary approaches we just referred to almost always result in weight loss, time-restricted feeding doesn't have to involve an energy deficit, and it doesn't have to involve weight loss. So the way that we defined it was increasing the length of the overnight fast, usually resulting in sort of a 4 to 10 hour feeding window. But yeah, that's probably, at the moment, that's how I interpret those terms.
I think that's a fantastic summary. So in essence, what we call IF in the community, kind of what was spurred by the lean gain style Martin Berkhan-esque description that Omar, you talked about, is pretty clearly called and not disagreed upon in the research as time-restricted feeding. Grant, you've done a lot of work specifically on time-restricted feeding. Is there anything you want to add so that our terminology is complete?
Yeah, I think I agree with the vast majority of that summary. I think that was a really good summary. Exciting to be talking with you, Jackson, because I did really enjoy the review article you have. So I definitely agree that I would view intermittent energy restriction as the broadest term, which I think is something you all discuss in your review as well. I'd view intermittent fasting as still a broad term, but under intermittent energy restriction. I've done most of my work in that area. Off to the other side is where, Jackson, you did your trial and discussed some of that nice work. Within intermittent fasting, I would view time-restricted feeding as one of the three main subtypes of intermittent fasting. Jackson's completely right. There's difference in terminology among researchers and actually an evolution of terminology. If you look at some top researchers in this area, like Mark Mattson, Krista Verdi, Benjamin Horn, and so on, you'll even see some evolution in how the terms are used from, say, 2015 to 2019, 2020. So how I view it, how several others who do research in this area view it currently would be within intermittent fasting, you have alternate day fasting, which is fairly straightforward what it is. Periodic fasting, an example of that would be the 5-2 diet, but this would be where you'd have prolonged fasting periods as infrequently as once every few months or as frequently as up to twice a week. So we're almost up to alternate day fasting. And then time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding as a third subtype. So the things that would unify those, and the reason why I view them as all underneath the umbrella of intermittent fasting, is most of them do have a period of fasting longer than an overnight period. Though what a normal overnight period is certainly varies. There's some data on that here in the U.S., but and this maybe is a separate conversation for later. But you could absolutely have people who are, if you look from the outside just at the timing of their feeding, you're like, oh, they're following an intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding period, when in fact it's completely unintentional and there's no purpose for it. It's just how they prefer to eat. So that's a side tangent. But fast longer than an overnight fast. If you viewed this on the scale of weeks, there might be a reduction in eating frequency, though that is a separate entity within a short feeding window. And we've seen this in some of our studies. We'll have a short feeding window, but we'll have people eating 4 or 5 times in this feeding window. So they have a reasonable daily frequency, but it is truncated into a shortened window. So sorry, I'm getting off into a few tangents there, but yeah, so that's the only tweak. That this is how I conceptualize it. Intermittent energy restriction broad, intermittent fasting a little bit narrower, and in contrast to the things like diet breaks, some of the refeeds, some of that longer term stuff discussed in the review. But then under intermittent fasting, periodic fasting, time restricted eating, and alternate day fasting, with variations for periods of true fasting versus modified fasting, which modified fasting is a funny term. Obviously, the pure definition, you're consuming no calories, but you'll see many fasting trials where a small amount of calorie intake is allowed. Similar to what Jackson said, maybe 500 kilocalories a day. Some do it by percentages, like up to 25% of weight maintenance energy intake. So yeah, I agree with the vast majority of what Jackson said, and don't have as much expertise on the side where he's conducted his work, but that would be the only sort of tweak I would give in the terms based on what I've been seeing recently in the literature.
No, I love it. And if we want to even throw another wrinkle in, Danny, I'm going to kick it over to you. A lot of what Dr. Tinsley and Jackson were talking about is energy restriction. But as we know, and as a little flashback to the chrononutrition episode, you can utilize some of these fasting windows without actually being an energy restriction. Can you talk to us a little about just changing the windows without necessarily trying to institute any kind of purposeful change in calories?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of gets at where there is a separation between the origins of time-restricted eating or time-restricted feeding in the literature versus what most people have commonly come to see as daily intermittent fasting, which on the surface can seem very similar, but I think the goals end up being different. And I think both Jackson and Grant alluded to this in that with most of the intermittent fasting that we see either from the bodybuilding community or even in the area around interventions that are aimed at weight loss, which most of those kind of fasting trials are. If we look at time-restricted feeding, that was kind of born out of looking at chronobiology or considering the circadian rhythms within the human body and how that may have implications for when we eat. And so what that does is, number one, like you say, means that we're not only looking at weight loss or as a dieting intervention, there could be potential benefits for metabolic health and glycemic control. And in fact, I would think they're probably two of the most important when we look at some of the published literature already. And I think it also separates why we're looking at some interventions that compare early or later feeding windows, or why that's even a consideration, in that it's not just the length of the window that may matter. There's now a look at, well, does it matter where in the day we place that? So that's clearly not just coming at it from an energy restriction perspective, because the energy restriction in both cases would be the same, but potentially there could be an impact on metabolic health where in the day that is placed. And the kind of underlying hypothesis would relate to the circadian biology and the circadian rhythms of certain hormones and our metabolism that may preferentially make one type of feeding window better than another. So I think you're right. There can be benefits to be gained outside of body composition. And I think right now, particularly for a lot of the TRE literature that we'll probably get into, some of the kind of most exciting results from a general population perspective may relate actually to some of those metabolic health parameters.
Mm. So Omar, what I'm hearing from our experts is that kind of, even if we talk about the more well-educated consumer of content, not necessarily directly peer-reviewed content, which I don't think is an expectation that we should have of most people, they kind of have in kind of the fitness community some general perceptions around, hey, meal timing doesn't make a big difference for body composition, like you said. And there's this option that if I want to eat in an intermittent fasting protocol, which is actually time-restricted feeding, this can be a useful way to cut or maybe maintain my body weight. And it doesn't really make a huge difference, but it might be good for behavioral reasons. Now, the interesting thing is that those aren't necessarily untrue statements. They are generalizations, I would say. But I would say for the average person who is reasonably in shape, has been training for a while, and does a lot of the other things that we institute, that's decently okay. But I think it leaves a lot on the table, and it leads to a lot of conversations online where a lot of nuance is missed. They think that's the entire, like, pin in that discussion. Someone starts talking about fasting later in the day versus earlier in the day, or eating multiple times, or this and that. And hey, that's not evidence-based. That's not science. That's bro science. Yet, as we can see, there's a robust amount of data on this, research, divergent views, differing camps, and even purposes, whether that's metabolic health or whether that's body composition change. So I think this is one of those times where you can get someone who might misidentify someone speaking to a certain nuance of research as bro science. And do you think that's an accurate way of viewing this, Omar?
Yeah, kind of the way I conceptualize it is like a trainer, the role of a trainer trying to get someone to lift more weight, where we talk about, let's say, technique. If you're trying to, educate the average individual and bring them up to speed of what's important and what's not, you need to give them those heuristics, right? Dirty, fast rules that apply most of the time. And you don't want to overcomplicate things. So that's why I bring up technique. You're trying to squat. Okay, here are the 3 essential cues, man. You want to make sure you're bracing. You want to make sure the bar's resting comfortably. Choose a stance, once again, that you feel that you can achieve balance throughout the entire range of motion, and squat. Does that cover the entirety of the squat? No, it's far more complex than that, especially if you want to get the most amount of pounds out of the squat. But will that get you started? Will that get the party started so you could squat effectively and make progress? Yeah. But I see that the most egregious, I think, offense would be when people parrot what they've heard and they're trying to educate other people as a full stop, right? So it's one thing to be coaching someone. So you're coaching someone, you're trying to bring them along, trying to get them out of the cave, out of Mike Teixeira's cave that we'll all never get out of. Bring them along, and then if they want to seek higher learning or more education, here are some more resources where you can understand the complexity. But when you put the full stop and you reduce it, so you not only are you reducing the noise, but the signal around the conversation, that's where it could potentially become dangerous. And let me just say real quick that our boy, D. Lennon, said TRE, time-restricted eating, which sounds a lot like JRE, the Joe Rogan experience. So I see we're edging our way here, Eric, onto that show. We're about to blow his mind because he's going to say, and I know our man Danny's actually you're the perfect Trojan horse for Joe because you train MMA fighters, and he'll say crazy shit like, well, my jiu-jitsu guys, when they don't eat for 4 hours, like they just perform better, and you're about to blow his mind. He's someone, actually, speaking of a kind of a communicator, these more in-depth conversations can be useful once again, so people don't just have that full stop conversation, reductionist. Here's one sentence: meal timing doesn't matter. Ugh, you want to talk meal timing? Someone ask an innocent question in the comments. Like, let's say Eric makes a post or something, or you, Danny, like Sigma, you make a post, and then someone else chimes in. Don't even worry about, like, what are you talking? No, right? Where they full stop, they silence the conversation before any more nuance can go on. So I do see the danger for sure.
Yeah, if you'll indulge me for just 2 minutes, I think there's a useful analogy here that might be good for listeners, and it's the way I've tried to conceptualize and communicate what the problem is. And I think you actually at the very start, Omar, alluded to this, that it's been an overcompensation perhaps on some sides within the evidence-based community that has led to bite-sized conclusions that then get extrapolated beyond what they meant. So as an example, we've seen a place from a lot of misleading and even inaccurate claims about meal timing that were rightly pushed back against, and to say, hold on, we don't have good evidence for this, or once you match your overall caloric intake and your macronutrients, there's probably not much difference. And that gets gradually reduced down smaller and smaller to this kind of conclusion of, oh, meal timing doesn't matter, which is clearly not the case, but is a conclusion that still gets perpetuated now. And we've actually seen it recently off the back of a recently published study, which we may reference later. And I think the way for people to conceptualize this is we've seen the exact same thing with if it fits your macros, in that early in like the bodybuilding.com forum days, when people were like constantly talking about, is this food bad, or is this food inherently fattening? Do I need to take this out in a cut? People, to give a nuanced evidence-based perspective, were like, look, if your overall caloric intake and macronutrients are in place, and the bulk of what you're doing is, or the bulk of your diet is good quality, then changing this food for that food is not going to make any real difference. Stop worrying about it. And because that's a kind of a mouthful to keep regurgitating, it gets broken down to this bite-sized conclusion of, look, if it fits your macros, which then taken to the extreme, and you give the example of people now eating like how many donuts can I fit in a day, that is a conclusion that is different from what was originally meant, what was originally meant is there's still the foundational concepts around nutrition still apply, and you still want most of your food intake to be probably decent. But some changes here don't really make a difference. Not as long as you hit macros at the end of the day, nothing else in nutrition matters. And so I think the same thing is applying here. The idea that meal timing doesn't matter has been something that has just been reduced down from a well-intentioned place of saying some of the old claims around meal timing were misleading or inaccurate or just wrong in some cases.
Danny, I love it. And I think you get, if I want to even go even higher level, and I promise not to make this tangent last too long, good scientists will only add complexity if it adds an element of precision or it betters our understanding. And I think a scientist or anyone who's ever dived hard into any subject, whether that's science, music, art, history, whatever, knows that there's an effectively infinite level of complexity you can get to with any topic. But if we're talking about something like sports science or exercise science or nutrition science, it has an applied nature, which means that that complexity should have utility. And utility is going to be defined by the specific context and nuance. So I kind of wish we could make this paradigm shift to, instead of going to either principles or, all the complexity we possibly can, but understanding there's always more complexity. There always can be more complexity, but complexity isn't bad or good. It is needed when it's needed. And then people could understand that when we're trying to do what's essentially signaling and messaging, like if it fits your macros, is like, okay, we need to turn this ship around. You guys are going the wrong direction. There is not necessarily utility where you're headed for your goals. That is not to say there's never a time to go down that direction, but hey, here's where we need to get the conversation back on track with. So, as this is Iron Culture, and as we do like to explore the nuances and the extremes of lifting, I think that's where we need to understand this. Like, we're going to go into a level of complexity that may or may not be useful, but that's something you can decide, dear listener, once you have all the information. So, education time, folks. Do with it what you will. So, one thing that I have been reflecting on as you guys have talked about all the various terminology, definitions, utility, and different perspectives, is that some of the reviews that have been done where they will do a systematic review or meta-analysis and compare everything under the umbrella of what might be considered intermittent energy restriction or intermittent fasting versus continuous energy restriction, and they've almost all of them have come out with saying there's no difference. And therefore, hey, you can use this, but probably not better than continuous energy restriction. That to me seems like almost kind of like missing the whole point. Like, should we be even making a systematic review where we compare these 5 or 6 arguably different distinct types of energy restriction to continuous? So what are your guys' thoughts on that? I'll open the floor.
We actually made this same comment, Eric, in our review paper when basically we were trying to review the literature on intermittent energy restriction, and we did have numerous systematic reviews and narrative reviews to pull from. But the problem that we realized quite quickly, like you said, the substantial variation in the dietary intake that people were having during energy deficit periods and the dietary intake that they were having during refeeds, diet breaks, or ad libitum feeding periods was so substantially different that if you collated all of those studies into basically generating a meta-analysis or basically a trend figure or an effect size, most likely what's happening is you're just rubbing out so much noise, and that potential nuance is basically getting masked in the substantial variation of all the different protocols that are getting sort of stuck together, if that makes sense.
100%. Grant, looked like you wanted to say something too, buddy.
Yeah, so I agree, and then I want to kind of do set the volleyball, so to speak, to Danny, because I'm curious to get his input on this. But I was looking at a meta-analysis earlier because there was a meta-analysis that popped up specifically with early time-restricted eating. And I was surprised because I didn't think there were that many studies. And there were a few other studies they pulled in that weren't called time-restricted eating, but that did follow those principles. So they were calling this time-restricted eating. I was looking at their inclusion criteria because I was curious, like, where did they set this cutoff? for early time restricted feeding, and it just had a generic statement about we included feeding protocols in which the feeding was aligned with circadian rhythms, with no other definition. And then looking through the table, it included studies that I think went up to 7 p.m. feeding. But then it cut off. There are a number of studies now that will cut off, including a few of our own, cut off feeding at 8 p.m. And those weren't included, but 7 p.m. was included. But you also had studies in there where the feeding stopped midday. Individuals would eat like breakfast and lunch and stop at 2 p.m. And that was lumped in early the same as stopping at 7 p.m. So along those lines, and that's the specific example with time restricted eating, but along those lines, I was wondering, is this actually useful to combine these in a meta-analysis? So you don't have to answer that, or if this is getting us off, feel free to chop it down. But I was curious what you thought on that, Danny, with that difference from the chronobiology's perspective of stopping eating around lunch to 7 p.m. Like, should we group those things together?
Yeah, I think, to keep it short, I think this is a problem that extends just beyond this concept to nutritional science more generally. And on our podcast, we've kind of talked at length about how meta-analyses in nutritional science can be problematic in that, if depending on what studies you include, can actually just make the issue worse, that there's more noise created. You then have to go and look through all these individual studies, which most people don't do. Thankfully, you did in this instance, Grant. And so what the other problem then is that people put more faith in a meta-analysis than they probably should, just because it's a meta-analysis. Again, kind of misunderstanding the difference between that evidence hierarchy versus standards of proof, thinking that a meta-analysis is inherently better than an individual trial, which may not be the case. We could actually maybe learn more by looking at individual studies. And to me, this strikes it as a clear example. As you mentioned there's such a difference in those types of studies. I think it's kind of complicating the issue, particularly when we don't have enough similar types of studies in this area. And then even going beyond it, and it was a point I was going to bring up later, and we'll probably get to again later, that also confuses the issue, is that we need to consider the calorie distribution within those windows to make a fair comparison. So just knowing the time of the day when the window takes place may not give us all the information we need unless we know where bulk of those calories are. So yeah, I would be inclined to agree with you, Grant, that the kind of bulking all those types of studies when there's enough difference there is probably going just to predispose us to more likely of just finding null findings, where in fact, if you look at individual studies, we may find something much more interesting. That's just my perspective. Yeah.
I think that's well said. And I think this is the type of thing that can lead someone to confirm their biases, right? So what these gentlemen are getting at, dear listener, is when you do a review, a systematic review where you kind of do like this is not a pun or anything related to what's going on currently, like a vote counting method, to where you're just looking at, okay, how many of these studies found leaning towards this intervention? How many studies went towards that intervention? So it's 6 versus 3. We have some tentative conclusion that A, it's better than B. That's kind of the way most systematic reviews that do more quantitative assessment work. Meta-analyses do proper statistical comparisons. They do weighted mean averages, differences, and then they produce an effect size, like Jackson said. Now, if you were to look at one of these systematic reviews or a meta-analysis comparing continuous energy restriction to various forms of intermittent energy restriction, it would produce that. And if your bias was coming from that kind of that evidence-based community, it doesn't matter. Like, this stuff doesn't matter for body composition. And you came across one of these reviews that said, either one works just fine. You're like, look, all this time and energy spent on studying this, and look, it says, like, for all 5 of these different things, it doesn't make a difference. But when you actually look at the included studies, if you see they only had 1 time-restricted feeding study, 1 5 and 2 study, 2 alternate day fasting studies, and then 1 other type, and these are made-up numbers, but I don't think I'm inappropriately describing some of these reviews. Is that actually a review? Like, does it actually tell you something about all 5 of these types of intermittent restriction, or are you comparing 10 caloric continuous energy restriction studies against 1, 2, and 2 of these other types? And I think that's not something that you would normally do in a meta-analysis. For example, in peer review, I recently asked some authors with threat of rejection to change their conclusions, because they did a meta-analysis where they were combining percentage-based training, velocity-based training, and RPE-based training, and per their and also I think rep max training. So it was basically load prescription meta-analysis. And per their inclusion criteria, they had a very strict standard. You had to have a control group. You had to meet all these different criteria for an RCT. And they didn't include any studies using RPE or velocity because it didn't meet the criteria. And their conclusions were, therefore, we should probably do percentage or RM-based training because there's no evidence to support RPE or VBT. Even though there are about 2 RPE studies now, maybe 3 or 4 longitudinal training outcomes on VBT. They just didn't meet the inclusion standard. So you can take the concept of a meta-analysis, which at its best, the right position at the top of the hierarchy, and if you don't accurately represent what we know, well, it's in essence not a meta-analysis in principle, because it's not meta-analyzing all the information we have on a given topic. So I think that that's a really, really important thing, is that we do have an understanding of where the meta-analysis should sit. We do have standards for it, but the standard for what is included is pretty much determined within each meta-analysis in isolation by the authors, which means it is, victim to human error or subjectivity, I should say, not necessarily an error. So anyway, that's going to be the end to that tangent. Is there anything else you guys want to add on that before we move on?
No, I'm good.
Awesome. All right. So another thing that we, I guess the exclusion to the rule of, meal timing or meal frequency doesn't matter, is things like refeeds and diet breaks. And I'm going to kick this over to you, Jackson. In the bodybuilding community, not everyone agrees on this. Don't get me wrong. Some people think that refeeds and diet breaks are unnecessary or even counterproductive or harmful. To give a shout out to Sigma Nutrition, there was a really good discussion that I had with Menno Henselmans about the pros and cons and the ways of looking at diet breaks. And we had both read all the research on it, and we had, different takes. And I would say we were probably both, I don't want to speak for Menno, but I think by the end of the conversation, we were both a little more open to the other person's side. So, Jackson, talk to me a bit about refeeds and diet breaks and what limited data we have on it, and how does that compare and contrast with, because you are a bodybuilder, my man's jacked, how does that contrast with what you'd been exposed to before you really started digging into the literature and doing your own research in this field?
Yeah, so I'll kick this off by first saying that sort of 2019, when I was starting to dig through the literature and we started framing our review paper, I was very much so waving the flag for refeeds and diet breaks. And I did believe that we had sufficient research to support the efficacious use of these strategies and that they were going to enhance the fat loss and weight loss process. My perspective has somewhat changed recently with the release of the Campbell paper with the double-day refeeds at the end of the week, and obviously since conducting our diet break study, which I will say, without sort of blowing too much smoke up my ass, I think it's the most well-designed intermittent energy restriction study that is relevant to athletes that's ever been done before. And it's even been the largest weight loss trial that's ever happened within athletes within Australia. So, we had a comprehensive list of outcome measures, anything from performance to body composition to hormonal regulators of the variables that we're interested in. So it was a very solid study. So a lot of my perspectives, obviously, I feel most confident sort of reaching my opinion based on the data that has been coming out of that study, because I'm very confident in the way that study was carried out and the way that we basically examined our research question. So going back a further step, there was the Mitchell paper that was published in, I believe, 2017, which interviewed a bunch of bodybuilders on the different sort of dietary strategies that they were using for contest prep. And an extremely common report was the use of these refeeds and diet breaks during contest prep. So this was 2017, even before we really had any research to go on whatsoever. We didn't have the Campbell group. We didn't have my research group either. And the bodybuilders were basically publicly reporting extreme success using these strategies, and they were talking about like preserving metabolic rate and replenishing glycogen. They reported an easier contest prep with respect to fat loss and being able to maintain a higher energy intake. So reading that, it gives you the impression that at least there's an extremely strong perception that these strategies do work for bodybuilders when we're at least looking from an anecdotal perspective. But when we actually start looking into the research, more specifically in the trials that have been conducted, I think that we can be a lot less confident with the conclusions that we make. Now, some of these listeners might say, well, the Campbell study with the double-day refeeds, they showed that refeeds preserved more metabolic rate and they preserved more lean mass compared to continuous energy restriction. But I actually have some substantial gripes with that study, and I don't actually agree that the conclusions that were arrived at in that paper actually line up with the data whatsoever. Like the researchers were nice enough to put the original raw data as a supplementary data file. So I've analyzed that raw data because the numbers, the statistics and the conclusions weren't really making sense to me, and I've run the analysis, and there's no statistical difference in lean mass preservation or metabolic rate preservation between the refeed group and the continuous energy restriction group. So with that in mind, I just don't really understand how you can make the conclusion that lean mass and metabolic rate is being preserved.
Jackson, can I jump in just for a second?
Yeah.
And I think because I actually ticked, yes, I will disclose the fact that I'm the reviewer. I can state this. I'm not under confidentiality rules. If I am, Grant, you might know better than me, and we'll edit this out. But I was the reviewer for the Campbell paper, and I'm also the reviewer for your guys' letter to the editor on the Campbell paper. But so just to be fair,
Senator Palpatine.
There was a between. Yeah, I have my fingers on all pies. There was a significant difference between groups for dry fat-free mass. Correct. That you found even when you analyzed not only per protocol but per assignment to protocol. So just to give a little bit of credit there. Now, granted, the way they did assess dry fat-free mass, I'm sure the body composition guru here, Dr. Tinsley, might have some thoughts on that. I don't think it has been done previously in that way. I don't know if it's been validated, but I do think we have to give a little bit of credit where credit's due there, that there was that significant difference between groups.
I was making my way there.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I jumped in too early.
My next question to you, Eric, is, and I didn't bring up this point in the letter to the editor, but my issue comes with the timing of that final measurement, which happened 48 hours after the final refeed. So we've got a measurement point happening after 7 weeks of a continuous deficit in one group, and then we've got a measurement point happening just 48 hours after the final refeed in the intermittent dieting group. Now, what is the likelihood that after just 48 hours after the refeed, that increase in dry fat-free mass that we're seeing is not just temporary residue from glycogen that's happened only 48 hours? My other issue is that it happens 48 hours after the study was completed, and the authors made no comment with respect to what the participants were eating in those 2 days after the study. Because if they've just been 7 weeks dieting, are they going to be jumping back into a deficit after the study is completed? Perhaps not. So do we actually have the measurement point 4 days in energy balance? Do you understand what I'm saying there? And that just makes me a little bit skeptical of that dry fat-free mass difference, considering that we didn't see any differences in the lean mass and metabolic rate analyses.
We didn't. No, I think that's fair. And then there weren't significant differences between groups for fat-free mass and RMR, and there were some. I mean, it's a small sample size study. It's the first one, so it is very possible that the within group differences, the differences in effect sizes, if the study is repeated, we find that is a collection of noise leaning to seem to favor one group, and sampling variability, and finally that 48-hour time frame influencing it. But I think it's also maybe just as equally possible, if not more possible, just kind of the direction of all those findings, that maybe there's something good going on there. So I don't disagree. I just think, maybe the and I think also you guys did a great job with the critique, and I think it's a good way for people to not get overly excited about any single study for sure. Do we want to take a second and bring Grant in, get your thoughts on the Campbell study before we continue? Carry on this tangent?
So I've read it. I haven't looked at it recently enough to comment in detail on the methods. The general point Jackson is making, though, I think is very well taken about how important timing can be when you look at day-to-day variability in body comp measurements, especially by technologies that might be slightly less advanced, and you consider the day-to-day error, and especially how labile things like, and we talked about this a little bit more detail in the last episode, but how labile, glycogen stores, water stores, all those things are. Without diving into the details, the point's really well taken, Jackson, about how critical those time points are. Well
said. Thank you for that, Grant. So moving back along before I interrupted you with with my insider information that I'm not even sure I'm supposed to disclose at this point. But again, just to be clear, there are two options in both of these reviews I did to click like, hey, put my information out there. You get to know who I review. And I love the concept of open reviewing. I think this is a total side tangent. The idea of having blind peer review is great. But now with the internet and the concept of open science, I actually like the idea of everyone knows who everyone is. Because then I think you get reviewer 2 stop being an asshole and actually has to give reasonable feedback. And it's if you do put out very obvious bias, or you just totally phone it in, your name's on that. So personally, I think that transparency is a positive thing. So if anyone ever wants to just Google like reviewer Eric Helms, you can see all the times I've reviewed stuff, because anytime I get the option, I always tick yes, let them know who I am. Anyway, Jackson, carry on.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start moving a little bit quicker because I was rambling a bit. So with the diet break study that we carried out last year, the findings seem to fit quite in line with the true findings from the Campbell study, in respect that it doesn't really seem like diet breaks are enhancing body composition adjustment over like a 12 to 15 week weight loss period when we compare it to continuous energy restriction. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think there's any merit in diet breaks. We saw really exciting data that showed that the use of diet breaks can actually reduce overall the hunger response during weight loss. Now, that's an extremely important factor when we consider like just how many people during weight loss are truly 100% compliant. I'd say rare to none. So if we could potentially design a dietary approach that's allowing you to manage hunger more easily, then that's going to in itself have an indirect effect on potentially improving the body composition outcomes. And we saw much higher hunger and reduced satiety in a continuous energy restriction group, which makes me think that if you are just dieting straight with no breaks, no refeeds or anything like that, you're just going to have a harder time battling hunger, and you're probably going to be more susceptible to having those little oopsie moments and things like that. Mood state was also substantially more positive with the use of diet breaks. So perhaps that could just be from not being so damn hungry all the time and they just feel a little bit happier. But I also don't think we should undervalue the potential that for sort of social occasions and social meals can have on the psyche. Like prep and weight loss and fat loss, if you're doing it pretty tough, it can be quite a socially isolating experience, and the ability to go out and have a meal with friends and family when your calories are a little bit more flexible or more manageable can do worlds, I think, for the psychological disruption happening along the way. I also do think, like alongside the hunger, the adherence benefits are probably the main advantage that are coming from these refeeds and diet breaks. And I think perhaps it could explain some of the positive findings achieved with diet breaks and refeeds in earlier studies, in particular the Matador study, which was sort of like a trailblazing study that directed sort of a lot of discussion in diet breaks. Now, they showed superior fat loss, reduced weight regain, and reduced fat regain compared to continuous energy restriction. and they also showed a significant preservation of resting metabolic rate. Now we could take that on face value as, okay, diet breaks are allowing us to preserve our metabolic rate, so we're able to basically have a larger energy deficit throughout the weight loss period and lose more weight and more fat through that process. But although it was statistically significant preservation of metabolic rate, we're talking like 100 calories per day, which probably isn't practically significant, and it's certainly not enough to explain the weight and fat loss differences that were achieved with the diet break group, which tells me, if I consider the findings that we had with our diet break study in showing the reductions in hunger, just perhaps that diet break group, although it was in overweight men and not training athletes, perhaps they were just having an easier time managing their hunger during the weight loss, and that allowed them to stick to their calories a little bit better versus the continuous dieting group who probably had a few more oopsie moments along the way, and perhaps that was indirectly sort of putting the fat loss brakes on.
I think that's well said. And this actually goes back to the episode, Danny, that you had with Cliff Harvey, where we talked about the ins and outs of carbohydrate intake and ketogenic diets. I think when you see anecdotes of people who have had great success with a given diet and they become proponents of that approach, the one thing you can be sure of is that it took far less effort than other approaches they've used to achieve success. And I can recall all of my contest preps. I have been leaner in one case than another, but I think I'm getting stupidly lean in all cases, unsustainably lean in all cases. And I've used different approaches based on my education level and what I've known and what I've tried out and different experimentation. And we've seen bodybuilders do this all the time. And typically what they will, when you hear bodybuilders talk about the experience, it's, was it easier? Was I able to diet on, and sometimes they'll quantify this with their macros, how much cardio they had to do, but most of the time what they're talking about is how brutal was it? Was I able to stay relatively positive and survive that experience with the most adherence and the least PTSD afterwards? Do I need to wait 5 years to compete again, or could I do a season in a couple of years? And I can say that as a coach who's coached hundreds to the stage. I can say that for myself, who's been through 4 contest preps. So again, going back to that keto thing, a lot of people might be getting the benefit of removing a lot of foods that lead them towards kind of going off the deep end. They might get the benefit of the known hunger suppression that occurs from a ketogenic diet. But we know from Hall's research in metabolic wards, they're probably not getting any fat loss advantage. They might be seeing a nice motivating drop in body weight that's more than they would have had if they did a lower fat, higher carb approach, but still equal energy deficit, which is motivating to kick it off, enhances adherence. It also suppresses hunger. And there you go. You've got some of these anecdotes, and then they're happy to confirm those biases with, a flawed understanding of insulin or something like that. That's understandable. And I think, you referred to that Mitchell paper, Jackson. I believe that's like those qualitative interviews with bodybuilders.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to do it again because I'm allowed to, because I was actually one of the participants in that study who was qualitatively interviewed, who has seen great success with, intermittent dieting on my own self. I don't know if it helped me get leaner or maintain more muscle mass, but it certainly is easier. And Omar, I'm going to kick it over to you pretty soon too, my friend. I think some of the more machine-like optimal mindset, evidence-based folks, when they look at research, they're like, I don't care anything about adherence or compliance. Like, I'll do it all. Yeah, you'll do it all, and you can manage that stress. But if you have to manage the stress, that means there's more stress. And I personally have found that I seem to get better outcomes in terms of, bottom line, what I look like on stage and how I perform. And my perception of the overall prep is more positive if I can make it less stressful. So, anywho, those anecdotes are not based in nothing. They may not be necessarily based in lab measured body composition changes. So Omar, I want to kick it over to you. You've had some experience with intermittent dieting in your own, and I know you've shared with me contrasting it with the more continuous approaches you've taken in the past.
Yeah, I mean, so similar to Eric prepared 4 times for contest prep. I lost 20 pounds over 16 weeks. I went from, Eric, what did you say, 25% body fat to about 19.4. So we had very similar experience. Just to catch everyone up, Danny, Grant, Jackson, as soon as you said Jackson's a bodybuilder, like I immediately had some connection with him for that very reason, us all losing weight. Now, Jackson, before I go on, I do have one question for those that can't see, that are just listening to audio. Did that painting come with the place, or is that your own abstract painting?
That is actually my mum's own painting.
'Cause I was gonna say-
we've actually got a talent in the family. Maybe she was just angry and she just started throwing like different like paints everywhere. I don't know.
No, I was gonna.
I don't know what she does down in the garage, man.
No, Jackson, I was going to pay you a compliment. That was a very interesting, just very quickly to go back 10 minutes, exchange between you and Eric, like just taking a look at, the study we had Dr. Campbell on, and just providing some insight into how one looks at a study, or maybe the interpretation or some of the considerations that might be had, as opposed to, hey, I'm a Google scholar here. Away we go. I'm taking a look at just the results. Oh, I'm just reading the conclusion. Bam, let me slap this in, an Instagram conversation, a very nuanced, detailed thing. So I thought that was very cool to see. And so just relating it back to that respect. Back to getting to the unbelievable conditioning of 19.4% body fat. There is sometimes, I feel, and Eric, we've spoken about this experiential almost gap between people who are coaches and have the experience of actually coaching people, and then just kind of talking on a soapbox. And what I mean when I say that, we talk about outcome-based decision-making. It's okay, we're saying that this, if you follow this, the most optimal scenario where you do this, it's more restrictive, you'll get faster results, you'll retain more muscle mass, If you're able to adhere perfectly, it's like, yeah, but what, in practical terms, right? What's the likely compliance of someone following this protocol? Oh, it's only 70%? Well, if instead you do another protocol, on the other hand, where your adherence is 90% or 95%, where you might have, where for myself, I did the diet breaks. Yeah, it might take a little bit longer. Maybe the outcome, let's say hypothetically, if there's a difference in outcome, but I'm more sure to arrive there on target. Man, if you're coaching people and if you want people to actually enjoy the process, have overall, kind of when they do a 360 review of what just transpired, you don't want someone to say, this was like, yeah, I got lean, but, I had no social time. I couldn't hang out with anyone. I was constantly sleep deprived. Like all these things that they report, it's like, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, any of these transformations. So it was exciting when you're talking about the sustainable physique paradigm, and we're talking last year where you met up, my boy was looking shredded, E. Helms on the stage, and I thought to myself, you know what? It is time to lose that 4%, because I know once you're below 20%, Eric, as we know, the extra like 12%, Jackson, you can attest to this. It's like that, right? It's like it's just getting below the 20% that's difficult. Anyways, we all can relate. No need to further elucidate. And so it was very interesting to me to change that concept, because I think we're all, especially, and maybe Danny, I don't know if you'd agree with this. We talk about social media or reducing things into bite-sized bits of information. We have that feeling where we want everything yesterday. And so when we want results, we feel that extra almost pressure on social media. Well, I want to lose weight. I want to do fat loss. I want to do the fastest available route. So initially, Eric, when we were talking, I didn't say this, not that I wasn't going to go through with it, but I was thinking, okay, I want to do this in 12 weeks. I want to lose a weight as quickly as possible. Let's just go right at him, right? And then the idea of, I'm going to take a week break every 4 weeks away now. Instead of 12 weeks, it's going to be 15 weeks. Well, dog, that's 3 more weeks or 4 more weeks I could spend, just getting stronger after the fact. And so I think when you take a look at the long term, the enjoyment, your adherence, where it didn't even feel like I was, to be honest, dieting throughout the whole time, would recommend 10 out of 10 every single time. And subsequently, we filmed a few videos, 1 or 2 videos just on the topic, and we put it out. The people that watched the videos that experimented with it, and this isn't conclusive by any means, but just some people that have tried other dieting methods, the ease of adherence was a huge factor in causing that paradigm shift. And I think as soon as you could kind of open the door and you have that success at least one time to prove that you can, then you could start experimenting, as you said, Eric, the knowledge hierarchy that occurs over time, where you learn more information, you adapt, you change kind of what your process is. But man, that foot in the door that time, 2019, it was a breeze.
And I just wanted to, so all the jokes about 19% body fat aside, appreciate that Canadian humility that you bring to the podcast. Only seconded by the Irish straight self-deprecation that takes it to another level that Danny will bring. I want to say you've been hanging out now for I want to say almost a full year at probably the kind of the lower end of your set point. And it's not like you're one of those folks who's constantly posting food pictures on Instagram and eating like a salad that weighs the size of a toddler every day. And like, this is easy. I'm perfectly fine maintaining this. I definitely don't wake up at 4 a.m. thinking about having a second salad. Like it seems like legitimately like food is not a focus of your life, yet you're hanging around in like, you could take a photo shoot at any time. And with the right filter, you'd get a lot of likes. You know what I'm saying?
Brother, you taught me about structure. You said, well, I was going to post it. You said, hey, adjust that structure and you're ready to party, my friend. Jackson's laughing because he knows it's true.
That's right. You only need like one dent in your glute. You turn that structure up, it looks like you were freaking shredded. Like Shelly Starnes in the house. That's right.
And Eric, you gave me the other hack, which was Eric taught me. So this would be 2018. It's 2019. We met up in Sacramento. Posing you're turning me into an animal. I'm not looking better objectively, but certainly with the filters and with the right posing and the angles, man, Instagram never got juicier. Let me just say.
Well, you know, if you can't get someone to actually change their nutrition, you just give them all the cheats.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
All right. Geez, that was good. So essentially, what we heard there is that Jackson started out as a true believer and adherent. Diet breaks and refeeds are the salvation to all our physique woes. And then he stares Cthulhu in the face, does the research, and he finds it is not a panacea. He loses all sense of his self, and now he's descended into a deep, dark depression. And he is a nihilist, saying that basically nothing matters when it comes to refeeds or diet breaks. Grant, I want to kick it over to you. Have you had that same existential crisis and a loss of reality within your studies of time-restricted feeding? Does it matter at all? 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours? I'm not even sure if 12 hours is considered time-restricted feeding. That's like a normal feeding window. Talk to me. What did you think about? What were your biases, if any? Or are you just the super scientist without biases when you went into your research on time-restricted feeding, and what have you found?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And I can confirm that Omar gave a really nice background of how everything evolved, because it was sort of interesting how I got initially plugged into this research area. So when I started my PhD at Baylor University, my advisor was Dr. Paula Bowney, and he had been first author on a position stand for the International Society of Sports Nutrition in 2011. And the position stand's topic was meal frequency. And Omar, you said this around 2012, there's sort of this shift that a couple of their major conclusions were related to the idea that these more frequent meals that are commonly recommended might not actually be beneficial for metabolic rate or body composition, with some important caveats about how little research had been done in truly like active individuals, athletes, even just heavily exercising individuals. But big picture, they came to, I think, thinking like, oh yeah, we're going to look at this and probably come out with some good support for higher meal frequencies. And that's really not what they got. So I got there, a few years after that, and that was sort of the background. So some of the early discussions with him were what got me interested in the other end. So it's like, okay, we know we don't need to do like 9 meals a day, 8 meals a day, maybe even 6 meals a day. It's like, how low could you go before there's like an issue? Would you be compromising exercise adaptations with, a couple feedings a day? What if you have these feedings pushed together, but you're still having, say, 4 feedings a day with adequate protein, but they're kind of pushed together a little more than you think might be optimal based on muscle protein synthesis data or something like that. So, again, I kind of got plugged in as we were moving away from that higher meal frequency and looking at, what does this other end of the spectrum look like? To be honest, I don't know. I don't really have a vested interest in it one way or the other. It's kind of funny. Sometimes I'll be, this has happened to me. I'll be at a conference and I'm like, between sessions, I'm eating something, obviously something with a lot of protein, having Subway with lots of chicken on it, something, and someone will come by and they'll be like, oh, I thought you're the fasting guy. Like, why are you eating right now? I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, of course I eat. I love to eat. Just because I research something academically doesn't mean, one, that I practice it, two, that, I think it's the best thing ever. It definitely doesn't mean I can't eat. So, it's just kind of funny. I honestly don't. I'm sure I have some biases. Everyone does. I was probably maybe slightly more optimistic just about the energy restriction, which you do see, I think, a spontaneous energy reduction if you shorten the window enough. So like you're just mentioning, Eric, you'll see some time-restricted feeding papers or where someone's defining time-restricted feeding and also known as time-restricted eating. People like to say eating if it's in humans because we have a choice, but it's feeding in animals because we control them, I guess. But you'll see something where it's like, yeah, up to a 12-hour feeding window. And there are people who do not practice this intentionally, who are eating all their calories in an 8 or 9 hour window each day. So I think, again, there's some differences between the intentional application of something and someone just eating the way they eat. And they could just wake up one day and be like, oh, I'll call this intermittent fasting since I'm eating all my, calories in this window. Have I even gotten close to answering your question? What was the question? You're asking me.
No, you got part of it. You're an unbiased, perfect researcher, so we got that established.
You eat Subway.
No, but yeah. So have you found So what have you found? If you had to give us the long elevator pitch, so elevator in the Empire State Building. Tell us about TRF. Does it work? Yes or no? No more complex than that. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll say the research. So my lab and the teams I've worked with have published what are currently the 4 trials of time restricted eating plus resistance training in a variety of training statuses, from recreationally active to highly trained, resistance trained, not true, what I think of as true athletes in terms of sports performance being a requirement for these individuals. The caveat would be we have not looked at anything really from the circadian perspective. This has been very much from a practical perspective, somewhat a behavioral perspective. So big picture, to summarize all the studies, I would, and my answer to everyone if they ask me would be that intermittent fasting broadly and time restricted eating in particular would be a viable but not inherently superior method for improving body composition. We haven't seen adverse effects on resistance training adaptations, with a minor caveat that we have a long-term study and review that was actually 12 months of time-restricted feeding with resistance training. That was a continuation of one of our other trials that has some interesting results, both on the health marker side and the body comp side. That might not be like shocking to anyone, but will probably give ammunition to both sides of the argument, depending on which variable you look at. So that is currently under peer review, so I won't chat about that too much right now. But based on the data that's out there, which is really just 6 to 8 week trials, I'd say viable option. The biggest thing I could say for is this very simple. So if you're not talking about the perspective of someone who is willing to do whatever it takes and micromanage everything, it seems to be, like, from talking to our research participants, from being involved in these studies, it seems to be a good option for the people who are like, yeah, I want to reduce energy intake. I would like to lose some body fat. I don't want to compromise my exercise adaptations, but I don't really feel like tracking. I have a general awareness of how much protein I need to eat, or I'll just like eat a decent diet and throw in some protein supplements, but I just want simplicity. For those individuals, I think behaviorally it can be a really nice strategy. I'll say also there's some individuals, and I'd say myself included, who prefer to eat a couple hearty meals a day and then a couple maybe small snacks that are essentially just protein. And I'd rather do that than eating a number of small meals throughout the day. And I'd also add some other, I'll just continue to add random caveats. All the studies we've done so far have performed the resistance training in the non-fasted state. So we really haven't, if you look at it, it hasn't been crazy far outside some normal sports nutrition recommendations. So in the most recent trial we did here, which was in resistance trained females, there were 2 different time-restricted eating groups. Both ended up having about a 7.5 hour feeding window each day. But if you look at their meal frequency, it averaged about 4.5 feedings in that period of time, partially because we had them supplementing with protein, partially because we encouraged them to eat like at the beginning and end essentially of that period. So if you look at it, you're like, okay, they're eating 4+ times a day. Their protein intake on average is up at 1.6 grams per kilogram. It was very simple, but it wasn't probably as crazy of a thing as people think. The control group, in contrast, which was required to eat breakfast, consumed all their calories in about 13-hour window. So those, were fairly divergent. We saw very similar increases in fat-free mass, muscle thickness, muscle performance, and so on. So again, big picture, I'd say the best thing going for is simplicity for people that just want a simple rule. They're like, either they don't want to track, or they have tracked, they're transitioning away from tracking. They're like, I understand how to get up to the amount of protein I want to eat in a day. I'd rather not log everything. And of course you could log with intermittent fasting. Just some people, I think, like the liberation of not having to do that. So those are some random thoughts and general views, but I'm happy to dive into anything else in more detail if desired.
Oh, absolutely. I desire you very much. So back in the day, Omar, we had one of our most popular guests on to talk about protein, Dr. Eric Helms, and he had a long monologue Yeah, he just really dropped some gems in that one. He talked about the difference in the applied versus mechanistic data on protein distribution, and how well, okay, I'll just use the first person because I'm not a douchebag. My impression of why there's differences between what we think maximizes MPS over the course of a day versus what actually maximizes fat-free mass in terms of protein distribution probably has to do with digestion kinetics, and how a lot of our research on protein is done in whey, especially for the sports performance perspective. So we're using an ultra-fast protein in a fasted state, not taken with fiber, lipids, anything else. It doesn't really look like the real world. And when we start to do things like, manipulate more realistic feeding patterns with casein before bed, when we match for total protein intake, or when we start to do peri-workout protocols, match for total protein intake, a lot of those mechanistic differences that are quite large when we're looking at just 14-hour studies type deal, they almost disappear completely when you look at the majority of research, so long as you're matching for that total protein intake. Now, the cool thing about TRF is it's an opportunity to change what is quote unquote a real world scenario. What is now ecologically valid is actually, oh shit, well, you're only eating in say an 8 or even a 4-hour time frame. So you have actually stretched the definition of what is quote unquote normal. And some of those kind of like meme statements that are in the protein timing or meal feeding kind of, those hot takes that we were talking about earlier, those bite-sized conclusions. Hey, as long as you can get at least three protein feedings a day, all good. You can do that in an 8-hour or 7.5-hour window, and you described how you did, and there wasn't a significant difference. How small is too small of a time-restricted feeding window? Can you do this in 4 hours, where you can really only realistically maybe get two protein spikes based on what we think we understand mechanistically?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd say we don't have that answer fully, definitely in resistance training individuals. There was one study we did that utilized the 4-hour fasting period on 4 days a week, and then unrestricted intake in terms of timing on the 3 training days. And that was that did not involve protein supplementation. Protein matching is very much like we're only giving the prescription of when you eat and kind of observing what we observe. And we observed less or no change essentially in lean soft tissue in this case, as opposed to an increase in the control diet. But the control diet did consume more protein. So this is very much saying, okay, if you're eating in this truncated window, you'll probably spontaneously not consume enough protein. This was in recreationally active individuals. This one did not have supervised training. This was just a side passion project in my PhD that was very, looking at it now, and I appreciated what you were saying, Jackson, about like when it's great when you have very high confidence in what you did. You're like, I know how we collected the data. I was there. I pressed the buttons. I did all, and that's how I feel about like the trials we've done here. But that was the first data collection I'd led from start to finish with little to no oversight. Just kind of, I'm like, I'm interested in this area. I want to do it. I'm going to get a team of other grad students together, and we're just going to do it. So anyways, we don't have that answer where we have fully protein matched really push the feeding window shorter. There was a nice study that came out recently from Krista Verity's lab, which she was a big alternate day fasting researcher, and I guess still is, but she did kind of like the definitive final study on alternate day fasting, and ultimately no benefits, higher dropout, just the whole deal. So I think she's maybe pivoted towards time restricted eating, and they looked at both 4-hour and 6-hour time restricted eating. They had some interesting lean mass data that I wouldn't put too much stock in. I believe not that they did anything wrong. There was just much lower variability in one group, so they ended up having a greater loss of lean mass, I think, in the 6-hour TRF group than the 4-hour group. But they showed the individual responses, and they were just clustered much more consistently in one group. So, I wouldn't put too much stock in it. But in terms of an exercising population, the protein intake we'd want to target, all of that, I don't think we've really had that answered yet.
Would you agree that if there was a preliminary lean of the direction, maybe we can't state whether it's for mechanistic or just logistical reasons, like it's hard to get enough protein in 4 hours, that may be too short of a window, something less than 8 hours? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, so I would say, like, I feel confident being like, for, again, resistance trained, but these weren't people stepping on stage. These weren't people who needed maximal sports performance, but resistance trained, about 7.5 seemed okay with enough total protein with, multiple separate feedings throughout. My guess would be at some point, it would be too low, and that 4 hours might be that window. Maybe I'm wrong, and you could 4 hours would be okay. I think if you went all the way down to OMAD or 1 meal a day, super aggressive. Some would view this as a form of time restricted eating with essentially a 1 hour feeding window when you're just eating one monster meal for an hour. I think that would certainly be too low, and that's a little more of an obvious example. I'd say 4 might be a little borderline, but my guess would be that would be narrower than optimal, whereas up 7.5, 8 seems to be reasonable for the general resistance trained population.
Fantastic. Jackson or Danny, is there anything you want to add to the TRF conversation before we move on to something else? Floor is yours.
There was a study published just recently, and I'm not totally sure what to make of it just yet. But basically, they had two groups. Now, this was we'll caveat by saying this was in trained cyclists. We're not talking resistance trained athletes here. But they skipped breakfast. So I guess we can interpret that as restricting the feeding window to later in the day. But they skipped breakfast, and then they doubled down with their calories at lunch. So they made up for that lack of breakfast by having a bigger lunch, whereas the other group, they had breakfast and they had lunch, but the calories were matched between the groups. And then they had an evening training session. And now logic would make me think that if calories were matched at the point where both groups were beginning the training session, that training performance should still be similar, particularly if it's in the evening. But the group that skipped breakfast, they still had inferior performance than the group who had breakfast and lunch, which makes me think that if we're trying to apply this to resistance trained athletes, if we're training in the PM, if we're training in a fed state, are we still basically at a detriment with our performance if we're not having breakfast or if we're having our first meal later in the day?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'd be interested in, you mentioned that was in cyclists, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I might have seen that pop up. I would be really interested to see that, replicated with a high volume resistance training session. I know there are some other relatively acute studies looking at, in habitual breakfast consumers, you skip breakfast, you perform resistance exercise, and your performance is impaired, which we'd expect. I'm curious if it would hold up in the exact same design you mentioned with resistance training. I know even some of the fasted training, which I wouldn't advocate for, with the caveat of using it as a train low strategy where you'll intentionally compromise performance to increase metabolic stress, but reduce carbohydrate availability selectively for that session. Obviously not where you need your maximal performance on race day, game day, or anything. But there is an interesting AIRD's meta-analysis on fasted training showing greater impairments of aerobic performance as compared to kind of the short duration performance, where it's a little bit more equivocal. So I'm curious if it'd be similar where if the calories, carbohydrate, all that were matched, if that one single larger meal at lunch would be okay in the context of resistance training as opposed to endurance training. But that's an interesting study. It'd be, maybe I'll write that down for a study idea for the next student project here. If
you guys don't mind, I'd love to kind of give my little thoughts on that little corner of the research. So there's actually 2 studies out by Naharuddin. The one that you referred to, Grant, where one group skipped breakfast and performed less repetitions on squat and bench collectively compared to the group that had breakfast. They did a follow-up where they gave, and I reviewed this in mass for those who are interested, shameless self-plug. They did a follow-up study where they had a placebo group that was given almost totally calorie-free orange sludge that was essentially it's pretty gross when you hear it. They actually preferred water to this meal, which I found hilarious. So they had a water only. They had this kind of
orange goop,
citrusy yogurt orange goop that they weren't told was calorie free, and then they had a carbohydrate goop. And there was no significant difference between the goop and the actual breakfast, but the water group did worse. So it may be it could be psychological, or it could be hunger hormone mediated. But I do think it's interesting, the study that Jackson's referring to, they made up for not only the calories, but also the carbohydrates at lunch that were skipped at breakfast. But then we have to remember how much more glycologically demanding cycling is. And we also have to understand that the time course of glycogen storage is not short. This is something I've thought a lot about in the terms of carving up for a bodybuilding show, someone's really freaking out because they didn't get their meal 2 hours before they get on stage, bruh, or sis, those 80 grams of carbs you ate 2 hours ago, you're going to be storing a very, very small percentage. That's not going to be the difference between you being full or flat. And I think perhaps the same thing is going on there, Jackson. At least that's what I make of it, is that despite similar total 24-hour carbohydrate intake, you probably had less glycogen actually stored in the group that skipped breakfast. But like Grant said, cycling isn't resistance training. It'd be very interesting to see that. And shout out to my current master's student, Andrew King. We're going to be looking at a low and a high carbohydrate pre-workout shake and a very volume-centric resistance training program. So we're talking about multiple sets to failure at a moderate load with not only squat and bench, but also military press and rows. So all those full-body boys and gals are going to be interested to see what to do with their nutrition from that study. So anyway, that's just a little peek into the future. Hopefully we'll have some more information on that because it is still murky waters. Danny, I want to kick it over to you, my friend, because I work with the realest of all real athletes, non-athletes, people who aren't strong, but they look strong. People who, their superpower is that they're good at competitively starving and looking good. And, their largest contribution to society is upping the standard for, what it requires to actually love yourself on Instagram, so that it's mostly unachievable. So while I work with the true athlete, the physique sport athlete, you work with some actual athletes, people who, instead of doing indirect harm through Instagram, they do direct harm by punching each other in the face. So I'd love to hear, you've probably thought about this from an actual, not only theoretical standpoint, because you're a curious dude with Sigma Nutrition, you've talked to a lot of experts, but also from an application standpoint. Is there much to manipulation of the timing of feeding? Maybe not even exposing someone to a calorie deficit or surplus, but just like the whole train low concept. I know this is something you've presented on, you've looked into it a lot. Is there something there for sports performance to be manipulating the timing of carbohydrate, or perhaps the timing of training in a state of no or high or medium or high carbohydrate?
I will answer that question, but again, if you allow me to indulge myself again, there's a couple of things that
you're at the most popular conference center in the world. You say whatever you want, my friend. You take the floor.
Not because we share our life or anything, but because we think you have a lot to contribute to this conversation.
To be clear,
that's definitely not true. One is just pure speculation that when you mentioned around the study Jackson brought up and it potentially being a glycogen issue, I have no idea if this is the case, but one interesting thing to consider is where you do have people who skip breakfast and then have their first meal as a typical lunchtime. In people who don't habitually skip breakfast or are not used to that, you tend to see a kind of worse postprandial glucose response. So it just means that they're less effective at being able to store that away. So that might even exacerbate the issue you mentioned. I don't know. The other thing that I had on my mind was related to TRF and the discussion around body composition. And I think Grant did a perfect job of saying where the evidence is now. And I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think it's hard to make a case to say in calorie and macronutrient match conditions you see necessarily a superiority. But one thing I did want to bring up, just because I see it misinterpreted a lot when this conversation arises, when you even hypothesize about this is something we can look at and see, is there a body composition advantage? People think you're trying to suggest there's some sort of magic going on with intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding, and that you kind of disbelieve in energy balance or calories. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that's not the case, that theoretically we could see a benefit for body composition, but because it has to influence energy intake or energy expenditure in a meaningful way. Grant already showed that when you don't control energy intake, in most ad libitum contexts, you tend to see people reduce their caloric intake, and you do see weight loss and fat loss in most of the TRF studies, particularly in general population. And that's quite a kind of common finding. And one of the cool things, I think, from a general population point of view, is that you see those changes when no other dietary advice is given. So you simply get someone to shrink their window with no advice about what to eat or healthy or anything. You see those changes. The second then would be, if you control calories, is it potentially could we potentially see a fat loss advantage? And this has been where people have some interesting ideas. As of right now, again, I agree, we don't have anything to suggest that is the case, but it could be mechanistically based on if eating in a certain restricted window or distribute calories across the day, if that were able to change energy expenditure, then you have at least a mechanism by which you could get superior body composition. And I don't know how far you want to get into that, but I think you could see changes potentially in physical activity, thermogenesis. There's been some talk around diet-induced thermogenesis, or TEF, and I think that's something I maybe mentioned in my article on Greg's site before, that I'm less and less, or at least I've more reason to believe it's actually not a big factor. We could get into that. But I just wanted to bring up just a general idea to people that any of these discussions aren't getting around energy balance, and that any even hypothesis around a superiority would have to be mediated by a benefit or a difference in energy intake or expenditure. And there's at least some studies that in ad libitum context, you can see a change in those. So just wanted to throw that in there. And now I'm ready to get to maybe the actual question you want, unless anyone wants to jump in on that TRF.
I would respond to affirm things you said just briefly. I think you point out two really important considerations with TRF. One would be, for some individuals or groups of individuals, if you want to call it behavioral superiority or just like practical superiority of this is very simple. It's been estimated with like a 4 to 6 hour feeding window. I think on average, the energy reduction is about 30% without tracking with an 8 hour window. If you start with someone with a prolonged feeding period, it might be around 20% energy restriction. So those are nice targets that people would want to hit. And if, again, for some people, it's like, follow this one rule and you might be able to get to that energy restriction without doing other stuff. For the general population, that may be great. And then totally agree with you on the physiological superiority. This is somewhere where I honestly often point out the limitations of our own work. I continually throw in this one reference that's actually conducted, or it's a commentary that was written by a few obesity researchers, including one who's here at Texas Tech, who's the former president of the Obesity Society. And it's essentially talking about the profound limitations of self-reported dietary intake beyond, I think most people have an awareness that it's like, oh, self-reported energy intake, there's a problem here. But their view is that they call it wholly unacceptable for energy balance research because of just how substantial the limitations are. And their view is that we need to move from this idea of like, oh, self-reported is flawed, but it's still better than nothing, to they essentially are pretty aggressive with it. They say this might actually be worse than nothing. But regardless of where you fall in that, I always point out that if we're having a free living study, even if our diet records come back and they look identical, or if they come back and there's so much variability in the data that there's no significant difference, that we can't put too much stock into it in terms of physiological superiority really at all, unless we could do like the metabolic ward study in resistance training individuals, the perfect study we'd want to see on this, which realistically probably won't be funded or won't happen. So anyways, I was just going to say, Danny, I appreciate how you pointed out both kind of the behavioral side, general population, this and that, and then also the physiological side where we could actually get into what's happening with energy balance. Are the same number of calories being absorbed? Is there different in any component of energy expenditure, so on and so forth, where we'd really need just a higher level of methodological rigor than we're typically able to do in our applied laboratories.
I would just capstone that off by saying probably the best would be having a YouTube channel recording what you eat for a day, and then reporting. I've been eating 5,000 calories, but it's on keto, and it has broken the laws of thermodynamics. I think those types of this is what we learn from the field in science. Where we see, because it's on videotape, folks.
Observational. They take photos.
I mean, you can't. You can't dispute it. So on video on YouTube,
public forum
numbers,
public forum,
fat loss. I mean, open science. What's the difference? Catch up, folks. But I'll leave that there. Let you guys do that with what you will. But Danny, please carry on.
I was just going to say it's interesting because I think it circles back to what we said at the outset of not trying to conclude that certain things don't have an impact just because we have some shortfalls in current literature. And as you were mentioning there, trying to go against self-report, Grant, I think one of the groups, Corey Peterson's lab, actually have a trial that's due to be published very soon. I think that there's some preliminary details available. That was a in-clinic intervention where they didn't see significant difference in fat mass loss, but it was trending in that direction. It was like P 0.9, but there was a significant difference in trunk fat loss. So this just opens up another avenue that if you're potentially seeing differences in loss of visceral adiposity, that can be very important, that we're seeing in a condition where they're controlling participants' food intake. And again, I don't want to talk too much about a specific study that hasn't even been published yet, but I just think it's interesting that we're starting to see these potential differences. And that was specifically an early time-restricted feeding intervention, I think 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. And I don't know if we got too much into early versus late, but again, just showing that there's more nuance to that question as well.
Well, we'll get there, Danny. And in the future, I want to try to get some experts on to help me to make sure that I only store fat as visceral adipose tissue, so that I can stay like appearing shredded. And you know what they say: you only live once. Don't really care if I get metabolic disease or heart disease at the age of 39. That's in 2 years, folks. So long as I can walk around appearing shredded while I'm actually at 20% body fat, mostly around my organs.
Have that bracing for squats.
Absolutely. And not only that, but I'm like, look, I'm shredded at 200 pounds. And people are going to be like, oh my God, Eric's on gear. No, I'm not. I'm just about to die because I've hacked the system in favor of aesthetics over health, which I need to get as a tattoo as a reminder. Write that down.
On the tombstone.
Yeah, who needs it? Yeah, I don't have time to get a tattoo, really. Exactly.
No.
Okay. Danny, so that was honestly a couple lovely tangents, and I want to go back to manipulating maybe not total calorie intake, but timing of training in relation to carbohydrate intake. Is there something there outside of for sports performance? And then my second question: do you think it applies at all to people who are maybe barbell athletes?
So there's definitely literature looking at carbohydrate periodization across the training week, or how much carbohydrate is available for different training sessions and the potential impacts of that. And the kind of underlying idea is that not every training session, the main goal of that training session doesn't always necessarily have to be performance. So for some of those training sessions, the goal could be to have a certain muscular adaptation that would have a benefit in the long term, that even if performance in that session was compromised, it may not be an issue. Now, most of this applies to endurance sport, cyclists, runners, etc., where you have a lot of training sessions, training volume across the week, but the nature of those sessions varies drastically from a let's say a cycle or a run where you're trying to drive performance, in which case you would want to be optimally fueled with full glycogen storage, plenty of carbohydrate on that day, and being able to do that session at its highest capacity. But then when we look at some of the interesting research that relates to carbohydrate restriction, and whether some people have proposed a potential benefit in sports performance, is that when you do a training session either with suboptimal glycogen storage for performance or a low carbohydrate intake in general, some of the adaptations that happen at the muscle can actually be potentially beneficial, where you get this like increased ability to oxidize fat at higher exercise intensities, as an example, or there's more production of mitochondria in the muscle, which again in the long term may potentially be beneficial. And so the idea is, well, if we took training sessions that performance doesn't really matter, so you're going for a recovery run or a recovery cycle, and then purposely do that in a carbohydrate and or energy restricted state, we can get these beneficial muscular adaptations, and it doesn't really matter that you're not performing your best because the goal of that session isn't performance. And so that's the idea. I think there's been the issue is measuring performance outcomes and how you choose what those outcomes are for various different sports. And when you look at end performance, there seems to be a kind of mix that some studies have shown no real difference, Some have shown a benefit to these various different strategies. And then the types of strategies you can use is a kind of combination of things. So you could have what's called like train low, which is training with in a low glycogen, low carbohydrate state. You then have others where you have what's called recover low, where after a training session where you deplete a large amount of your glycogen stores, you purposely don't fuel back up with carbohydrate. And instead that recovery period, so in the hours and maybe even overnight, you just consume some protein, but don't consume carbohydrate. And that again leads to some of these adaptations at the level of the muscle. So there's definitely muscular adaptations that occur. If they translate into performances where there's kind of a bit more of a debate, and I don't think like a clear answer across the board. And there's definitely better people to speak on this than me with maybe more of an update on this area. The question around how this applies to maybe barbell sports would be, I would be maybe less convinced about that, just because thinking of the nature of those training sessions, what's going to be the limiter to performance in those, and then just the kind of physiological requirements of them mean that I would suspect it wouldn't have the same payoff as it may have in some of these other sports. That said, on a practical level, there could be very much a reason to have differing carbohydrate intakes maybe across the week, or at the very least, consider what your training week looks like when you are planning carbohydrate intakes. And so rather than thinking, oh, I've got a big training session in a few hours, I better have a large meal of carbohydrate. Instead, you're thinking it well ahead of time. When was my last training session? What was that look like? How much probably depletion was there? When is my next priority training session? And then think of your fueling requirements accordingly. So that's an overview of my thoughts. I don't know if that's useful, but there it is.
100% useful. And I think this is one of those things where we think we've understood everything there is to understand about it. But as we get deeper, we learn more things. There was a recent study that came out that kind of opened a lot of people, maybe not in this specific research sector, but certainly in the evidence-based community's eyes about, muscle glycogen is not ubiquitous. There is muscle glycogen in different locations, and there probably is selective depletion around areas that are the most important for contraction. So that maybe you can have an overall moderate level of muscle glycogen depletion. You'll often hear people bandy about, hey, a bodybuilding session only depletes glycogen like 25 or 30%, which first, they don't necessarily understand that it's not like you don't have to be like, if you have a session where you only have 15% of your muscle glycogen full, you feel terrible. Like that's awful. I'm not even sure you'll get there. Without some pretty extreme protocols. That's not how it works. And that will have knock-on effects on other mechanisms to fatigue, I should say. But more so, is resistance training even glycogen dependent? And then even if you were to change the muscle machinery through these adaptations to get better at using fatty acids at higher intensities, or maybe you're trying to use ketones as a supplement so that you can be on a high carb diet, but be getting the consequence of breaking down fat at the same time, a lot of this stuff isn't panning out. And it almost seems that it's almost a selector, like that we don't get the option of getting to have the best of both worlds. It's very difficult to both be utilizing glycogen and sparing glycogen and using both fuels and having this panacea. So I would just put forth to the listener that, hey, maybe if you're a CrossFitter, keep some general awareness of the progression of this literature. But right now, it does seem that a whole lot of do about nothing. It's very, very difficult. And there's been a lot of people trying to figure out ways to quote unquote game the system in terms of endurance performance. And they haven't quite succeeded yet. Maybe that's not true on an individual level. And certainly it's not my area. So I don't want to just discourage anyone from reading this. And I'm sure there's some researchers in this area who wouldn't agree with that statement too broadly, but I'm not making it too broadly, and I don't think it applies to most lifters. So I agree with you, Danny. I appreciate that. More context to be had, more nuance to exist. All right. Let's go into more on TRF, but instead of the concept of just having a feeding window, when does it matter to have that feeding window, Danny?
So this is probably one of the areas where a lot of the research attention has been focused, and I think there's probably more coming of the next year or two with studies that are in the pipeline. And I think essentially the idea, it's mainly been a comparison of an early time-restricted feeding window versus a delayed or a late time-restricted feeding window, where you match the number of hours, so like 8 hours in both condition, but where in the day they're placed. And as of right now, direct comparisons, there's actually not a whole lot of as far as I'm aware. Grant probably may have more on this than me. But there's been quite a few that would compare, say, early time restricted feeding to a control condition or continuous feeding throughout the day. There's been a couple on a comparison. So I think Elizabeth Sutton had a paper where they compared an early versus late. I think it was a 8 or 9 hour window. So something like 8 a.m. to like 4 or something like that. And then the other one from like 12 until 9, something. And in that there was no real difference between the groups on most of the measures. I think the only one that reached significance was a slight difference in 24-hour blood glucose, although it wasn't really practically that significant. So I think that is in one way slightly surprising, in that if you were only looking at this from some of the mechanisms related to circadian biology, you might hypothesize there's a benefit to an earlier window. And I think that's why it's still being investigated, because I think there's hope that there can be. You certainly see a big difference when you compare it to just people's normal habitual intake. Again, how much of that relates to the early window depends. And I think where a lot of the metabolic health stuff might come in is mechanistically, we know that people's beta cell function is better earlier in the day. Insulin sensitivity in most tissues tends to be better earlier in the day. And so theoretically, if more of your intake is earlier in the day, there could be a benefit there for glycemic control. There's potential differences in digestion, which we can talk about. And then the final one is, do we potentially see a difference in energy expenditure when someone eats in one of those patterns? And there's some studies we can reference there too. But from an overview level, it's hard to give a clear answer right now, although hopefully we may have more answers soon. But I think maybe, Grant, you may have seen a couple of comparative studies that maybe I haven't yet, or I'm sure you have a lot more to add than what I've given there.
To be honest, I don't have a lot to add. I think you summarized it well. There are, not very many studies in my EndNote folder on early time-restricted eating. I agree there have been some select differences physiologically, but nothing too overwhelming at this point. Just as like a side note about that, I was recently talking to Courtney Peterson, who's one of the leading researchers in this area, and who I believe was the senior author on that Sutton paper and most of the early time restricted eating. And she similarly, even though they've had some positive results, similarly feels unconvinced at this point. Not to speak for her, except that she pretty much said this. I won't say more beyond that, but some initial possibly promising data, but definitely not fully convinced of this either. So I don't have too much to add in by way of diving into specific studies, because I think you summarized well that it's definitely eyebrow raising. I think there's a ton of interest. It's definitely the hot area within broadly intermittent fasting, and definitely within time restricted feeding or eating, but nothing too definitive at this point.
Love it. And for those who really want to get a deep dive on the chronobiology of eating, definitely go back to the last time we had Danny on, and we had a pretty robust discussion around how the traditional Martin Berkhan IF time-restricted feeding, where you basically skip breakfast and start with a late lunch, probably matches more up with the social demands of society. If you think about one of the very common reasons why someone goes off a diet is because of social obligations. They have to go out to dinner with someone, or they want to eat dinner with their family. But one of the meals that's probably the least social for your average working person is breakfast, because it's on the go. They have a short time period to do it. and it really is only something that is potentially social on the weekends with brunch or cafes, etc. So it might be one of these things where, based on chronobiology, you may get a better response by eating more earlier, but based on the modern society, might not be a great fit for someone who's trying to sustain a calorie deficit due to some of those factors. So anyway, that's kind of a high-level summary of a almost 2-hour podcast I think we had with you last time, Danny, and I'd encourage people to listen to that. It's a really good one.
One thing I'll just clarify, I said the Sutton paper was the comparison between early and delayed. I misspoke on that. That was actually the Leonie Heilbronn's group did a study that compared the two of those. I think the Sutton paper was 3 evenly spread meals versus an early one, as opposed to comparison.
I think it might be Hutchinson, might be the first author on the one.
Correct, yeah. Amy Hutchinson's paper. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Now,
Omar.
Danny, we're going to dive further because, Eric, we're getting on that Rogan podcast, and Danny's our Trojan horse. And I do think it's relevant because, as you said, we're describing just hunks lifting iron, individuals like Jackson just getting unbelievably swole. And we might look like we could beat people up, but individuals that actually get paid to beat people up, it's very demanding on the body. And so I'm actually curious because we're talking about, dietary breaks. We're talking about meal timing, meal frequency, and we're talking, losing weight over a relatively long period of time. I'm curious, Danny, because what some listeners might not realize, it's hell for fighters, right? In order to both cut weight, so a lot of water, but also just lean down towards a fight. Most fighters, unless you're a flyweight, we're talking welterweight and above, they're cutting 15, 20 pounds often. They're also not exercising. You want to talk, Eric, like us, we joke, preparing either for a show or just leaning down, like, I got diet brain. It's like, well, wait a second. You have to be in a caloric deficit while also doing an ungodly amount of endurance exercise and still trying to perform pretty well, keep your body in good shape, and then arrive in one piece to the octagon, so to speak. I'm just curious, Danny, and this is how we get brownie points for one Joe Rogan, how the impact of meal timing, meal frequency on, let's just say, endurance athletes or combat athletes. So those that are training at least, 10, 15 hours minimum a week. So they're expending a lot of calories. And also they need to lose weight at some particular endpoint. I think that's what makes it unique for MMA athletes, where you're not only expending a lot of calories, you're kind of an endurance athlete, but there's some point in your journey, at least one time a year, where you have to drastically lose weight. What is the relevance then of some of the discussion we've been having as it relates to, meal timing, meal frequency, and then even compositionally, what you eat throughout the day? Like, what are some of the strategies? If you give us, I know this is a big topic, but just working with athletes. So to give another perspective other than like we train, 3 to 5 times a week, hour and a half. And over here, we're trying to, get into some of the finer details. I mean, I assume it'd be very important to get granular when it comes to these combat athletes.
Yeah. So first of all, you said that you guys look like you could beat people up, but don't actually. The scary news is Jackson is actually a boxer as well. So he would also beat you up as well as look like a. I'm
taking you wherever I go, Jackson, just so you know, bro. You got no choice.
So he's winning all around here. In short, I think most of the stuff we discuss around meal timing, particularly if we're looking at something like TRF, it tends to be, I would say, contraindicated in most of the MMA athletes or boxers that we work with, in that most of the things that it does kind of go against what we're aiming for, in that most of these guys are training probably twice a day. They have 2 sessions that are quite demanding where we need to make sure they're fueled appropriately, but they tend to be at either end of the day. And so to try and shorten the window makes it kind of practically impossible, because you're either having to skip out fueling for the first session or maybe skip recovering with a meal after the final session, which is obviously not a good idea. And we, for most of the time, if they're not trying to cut weight, we obviously want to try and keep their intake high enough. So we're more looking at the fundamental things we know about good sports nutrition. So making sure their overall energy intake is appropriate, that they're getting enough carbohydrates for the sessions that matter most. Their protein is distributed across the day so they can recover muscular-wise from those training sessions. And just kind of fitting that into a routine as opposed to thinking, oh, the best thing ever is TRF and everyone has to do it, even if you have these 2 training sessions and we don't care about when you finish. So for practical purposes, it doesn't really work out most of the time because of training schedules and our other goals there. But for meal timing more generally, you're right that that's when it does need to become more granular. That, yeah, if we're lifting weights 4 times a week, you have a lot more leeway between 2 training sessions of when you get that appropriate amount of fuel in for that training session. Whereas if you have 2 training sessions on a given day, you may have 6 hours between them. That first session could be a 2-hour wrestling practice that was super intense, and now you've got to go and do another session that evening. Then making sure you not only have your timing appropriate, but you're getting it close to the finish of the training session, getting appropriate amount of carbohydrate in that session to give you the best chance of being fueled becomes more important. So those classic sports nutrition principles around nutrient timing that we think of are more applicable there than they may be for a strength athlete who has a much more longer time period. If you've 48 hours between training sessions, you don't need to focus on like slamming maltodextrin or waxy maize starch as soon as you finish one training session. You can just make sure over the next couple of days your carbohydrate intake is appropriate, whereas you may need to look at supplemental routes or just pay more attention to time in some of the cases with these MMA athletes. So that's kind of an overview, but happy to dive into any specifics. And I think Jackson would probably have a few things to add on this, given his experience in that field.
Jackson, our new bodyguard for the Iron Cult. I think, Eric, we just got to make it official. And the reason I bring that up right before you go on, Jackson, man, is that I think, speaking of what you said, Danny, about kind of some of the bite-sized information, just because it might not be entirely relevant to our small little niche, like, physique competitors or those of us who just lift iron, like meal time, meal frequencies, don't even worry about it, the general heuristic people give, doesn't mean that globally it doesn't matter. And I think combat athletes is a very good example where Jackson probably also, I don't know if you watched it, speaking about you doing boxing, MMA, UFC, but Brian Ortega, he had our guest, Dr. Andy Galpin, part of his team. And he said recently he looked fantastic against my boy, the Korean Zombie. I was a little sad my guy lost, but excited to see Brian looking just phenomenal. But he did credit, he said before that point, before he had Andy Galpin, he brought him on board to his team. Just, his nutrition was kind of all over the place. And he credited Andy with being one of the key factors, which I just thought was very fascinating. Just, a top level fighter actually saying that explicitly. Sorry, Jackson, before you go on.
Yeah, so I think that meal timing matters a lot more for athletes performing 2 sessions within the day, and particularly athletes like combat fighters who have at least 1 session a day, which is predominantly comprised of like high intensity cardiovascular efforts that could be lasting upwards of an hour and a half and beyond. I don't think that meal timing around the resistance training session matters that much. Like, yes, like as long as you're getting some protein and some carbohydrates an hour either side of the workout window, you're probably maximizing all the adaptations that you possibly can. But it becomes a little bit different when you might be having a PM session after that, which is going to be significantly more glycolytically demanding than the resistance training session itself, and is going to be likely going for much longer than the resistance training session as well. So in that scenario, that's when carbohydrate intake both before and during the session becomes even more important, because basically the goal will be to sustain a high level of blood glucose and muscle glycogen both before and during the session. So you don't have to rely on muscle glycogen so much to sustain that effort, which could potentially put you in a position where performance is going to become impaired, and even worse for athletes who rely on sort of muscle mass. Potentially that's when your body can basically look for protein as an additional energy substrate. So trying to summarize all that for the standard bros just doing an hour of resistance training, as long as you've got the protein and carbohydrates, like an hour either side of training, I think you're doing everything that you possibly can to maximize those training adaptations. But if you're training twice a day, and if you're doing like cardiovascular, high intensity demanding exercise, that's when carbohydrate manipulation around that session becomes even more important. And if you are performing those sessions that are going beyond sort of like an hour, I think that's when intra-workout carbohydrate intake becomes almost essential, because it's going to be damn near impossible to sustain a high level of blood glucose and muscle glycogen if you're not doing that.
That's well said, and I actually really like that we took this little combat athlete turn and talking about meal frequency and peri-workout fueling, because one of the very few studies that could be probably, I would argue, not that strongly in the column of supporting a higher meal frequency is a study by Iwao. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, and colleagues. Classic study that was actually on boxers, and they found better lean body mass retention in a group that was eating 6 meals a day compared to less, but they were eating like 1,200 calories, very low protein. I think it wasn't a very high sample size, and it had some design flaws, but that was one of the few times in the research that there was, a tick in the column of meal frequency might matter for body composition changes, but it was in this specific population. I would say most of the rationale in the practical setting behind eating a higher meal frequency has come from another extreme group, which is mass monsters like IFBB pro bodybuilders talking about the way they eat. And people sometimes go that, especially in my community, we don't need to pay attention to the eating habits of these enhanced bodybuilders because, steroids equal magic. And it's not that they're magic, like people think everything changes if you're on gear. If you want to get up to 300 pounds, you can't do that by taking steroids and eating 3,000 calories. You still have the requirements of thermodynamics. It might allow that 300 pounds to look a little less sumo wrestlery and more IFBB. And I think that's the main difference. But you have to eat a massive amount of food to get your body mass that high. And when you talk to some of these really big bodybuilders who maybe also have a high volume training program, you start to see some of the same strategies that athletes use to fuel performance. And that is eating multiple, smaller, but still pretty high calorie meals throughout the day, because it's the only way to logistically get in that kind of consistent fueling and not have your digestive tract turn into a nightmare and still be able to perform. So some of the food choices, some of the meal frequencies, some of the calorie distributions are borrowed from the realities of bulking when you're trying to get really, really, really big, or the realities of fueling when you're trying to fuel a very high energy expenditure. So I think that's just something that should be mentioned so that people understand that that's not bro science. That is just something that might not apply if you're only training 5 hours a week. So yeah, just want to put that out there. Omar, I think we're at a point in this podcast where it might be good, and I think the way we could frame it is to ask our guests what future research they're excited about. Because one thing that I think was really interesting about this conversation is that in everything I brought up, there was some big gaps. The critiques of the Campbell study were, it's not necessarily conclusive, but it's like the only study on refeeds in trained athletes. The critiques of the time-restricted feeding stuff, we don't know when the smallest window is because the data on that 4-hour feeding window is maybe not perfectly ecologically valid. And similarly, like you said, Danny, we don't have a lot of time-restricted feeding window comparisons where we have an early versus a late window compared. So there's a lot to be done in the future. So I would love to hear, and I'll just go clockwise in the order of my screen. What would be some future research that you're really excited about coming out? Danny, we'll start with you.
So for me, the big one, particularly as it relates to time-restricted eating, is looking at calorie distribution across the day. And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to time-restricted eating, but I think it falls within that area in that there's kind of 3 components to look at and oftentimes most of the stuff looks at two. So one is, what is the duration of that window? How long is the best optimal window? I don't think there's going to be one answer, but that's one question. The second then is, where in the day do we place that window? Is earlier better than later? And I think that'll be interesting to find out. But I think the big, or one of the potential confounders in both those questions that's also interesting is, where are the calories distributed across the day? So you could have comparing two, let's say, 8-hour windows, but one could have the bulk or most the percentage of those daily calories pushed earlier in the window versus the other has them all skewed towards the end of that window. They both have the same duration of feeding window, the same time across the day, but the impacts, at least metabolically, may be very different. So I think that would be an interesting one to consider. And I think there's enough to suggest there can be a difference with calorie distribution even outside of a restricted feeding window that is worth looking at. That if we skew slightly more of our calories earlier in the day, could that potentially be beneficial? And if we look at some of the epidemiology, we know that when there's a large proportion of that skewed later in the day, there are some downsides, not only metabolically, which is quite clear, but at least associations then with higher body weight or gains in body fat in the general population over time. So I think within a certain feeding window, taking into account the distribution is important, because it's conceivable that when we compare an early versus a delayed feeding window, for example, if the early window had all of it towards the end and the delayed window had all their calories earlier, that they might actually end up being pretty similar. So you're not really comparing two different strategies. So for me, the calorie distribution across the day is a big one to figure out how much of a role that is playing, as opposed to just looking at a set duration of a window.
Love it. I think that would. I agree. That is something I'd love to see more data on. Dr. Tinsley, stuff you're excited about for the future?
Yeah, I think there's some. I still have some interest definitely within time restricted eating. I think some of the questions we discussed earlier, pushing how short is too short, how short would compromise resistance training adaptations, even if you are, say, getting sufficient protein intake. That's something that's interesting. The early versus delayed time restricted eating would be interesting, though it'd be challenging with the training, whether you'd standardize like training to a certain time of day or training within the feeding window, whether that's early or late, because you obviously have some issues related to performance and probably some individual variability in how well someone would train in the morning versus the evening as well. So I think there'd be a lot of design challenges with those studies. I also have an interest in just other forms of intermittent fasting. So something like periodic fasting that you could view in some ways almost as the opposite of like a weekend refeed, where say someone's eating relatively normally throughout the week, but then does one 24-hour fast or one fasting period per week or every so often. So something in that realm would be interesting if it's a potentially feasible way to manage weekly energy intake while allowing relatively ad lib consumption most days of the week. So yeah, again, looking at different forms of intermittent fasting that haven't really been explored, continuing to play around with time restricted eating. Of course, our lab's interest is largely in some of the resistance training adaptation. So some of it will be in that realm, though I'll certainly, like some of the items Danny just mentioned, also certainly be looking at closely in terms of what comes out from, like metabolic ward studies and studies looking at health markers in general population in terms of the greater good of improving the health and well-being of society. But at the same time, we also want to continue to look into some of these strategies for those of us who just like to lift and want some different ways to look at the nutrition side of things.
Absolutely. I suppose we could do some work for the greater population. So long as, what comes first is, getting ridiculously jacked or far stronger than is functional for life. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I totally echo that. I'm getting more excited about future research the more you gentlemen talk. I'm going to complete the circle. Jackson, first unmute yourself and then let us know, because I muted you earlier. No offense, just because there was a little bit of background noise.
Yeah, so firstly, I'll say sorry for that. That chatter was my mum giving me a stern talking to that I'm going to be late for my lip surgery that I need to have today after a boxing injury. But anyway, so
He's the real deal, folks.
Fellow mama's boy, you're already in the clique. You're a bodybuilder as well as our future bodyguard. You can't be any more in, Jackson.
Okay, so thank you for that, Omar. I'm very excited to be in the clan. Now, for future research, I'm excited in the realm of intermittent energy restriction. We know that, well, we think that refeeds and diet breaks, they do have some merit, but we have substantial variation in how many days people are prescribing refeeds and diet breaks, and we don't really know what's optimal. So I'd really like to track a time course, like a daily time course, during a period of weight loss. So basically remeasuring some of the outcomes that we think might be affected by refeeds and diet breaks, like psychological parameters, hunger parameters, again, maybe metabolism and performance parameters, but basically remeasuring these outcomes after each day of a period of energy balance. So like a day 1, day 2, day 3, day 7, maybe even day 14, like we saw with Matador with the 2-week diet breaks, to see basically how much time should we be how much time should we be refeeding, or how much time should we be diet breaking to achieve some benefits in some of these parameters that we're interested in, or again, how many days is going to optimize? Like is there a limit? Like once we hit 7 days of energy balance, does further time in energy balance not provide any benefit? Because if that was the case, well then there's no upside for us running 2-week diet breaks. A second thing that I would like to dig into is based on, I guess, a theoretical rationale that perhaps refeeds and diet breaks might have a lot more application for people who are really lean versus people who are not so lean. Like let's say that if hunger is one of the main benefits of using refeeds and diet breaks, managing hunger, that could potentially lead to better adherence and better outcomes and a more enjoyable fat loss phase. For someone who's quite over fat, or perhaps only really early on in their dieting phase, they're probably not really battling with hunger too much. So is giving refeeds and diet breaks to this person really going to have much upside, or is it just unnecessarily extending the weight loss phase? Perhaps these strategies should be basically saved for later on in the fat loss phase when you're a little bit leaner and basically you're fighting a few more battles with hunger and adherence and psychology.
No, that totally makes sense. And that's something that I've promoted off limited evidence previously, an increasing frequency of refeeds and diet breaks for contest prep bodybuilders, as it makes more, at least theoretical sense as we get closer. But that's, again, lacking any true theoretical data. We talked about, Omar, you and I, we had Dr. Ben House on, how a really convincing argument is anecdote plus mechanism. So that's basically how I've been selling how to use refeeds and diet breaks previously. Please buy my ebooks. No, but in all seriousness, I think it's just in the absence of anything else. Like we don't have studies on bodybuilders getting really lean and using different approaches. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff to study for the future. Some of it's feasible, some maybe less so, but ultimately this is definitely a place to keep your eyeballs on. With that said, Omar, I'm thinking we tell the cult where they can find these folks and close this sucker out. Anything else you want to add?
I would, but my boy, aka my bodyguard, needs a surgery. So no, we're good to go because he needs to be 100% so he can be 100% for us. And I feel like there's more that could be discussed in a future episode. I could just say, in short, I've thoroughly enjoyed this one. I knew just the pedigree of the guests that we're having on. There's going to be a monster episode. And so for many reasons, but I think so much was covered in 2 hours. Not a moment was wasted.
Love it. So I just want to thank you all. Danny, where can people find you?
They can go to sigmanutrition.com, SIGMA nutrition.com. They can find the podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio on all podcast apps. And then on Instagram, I'm just Danny Lennon _Sigma. Or if anyone is on Twitter, Nutrition Danny is the handle. And any of those places, I'm happy to take kind words or negative words, but they will hurt me, so please don't.
Yeah, he's easily hurt. But you can meet him currently. He's in Philly, right, Danny?
Yeah, well, that was actually a spoof, would you believe? I had you fooled. Yeah, unbelievable, yeah. That's shockingly. This is just like a background. Yeah,
A digital background. Wow.
unbelievable what you can do with technology these days.
For someone that's trying to be mysterious and not know their location, it totally wouldn't be relevant to someone's, hobby if, Eric didn't want to.
Just the sole reason I have this, it's not for any joke purposes, is you literally cannot see this room that I'm in because it could be incriminating. So instead I have to use a virtual background,
Yeah, it could be, for example, covered in soft plastic. Maybe that's also why you're wearing a dark red sweater, so certain colors don't show up on it. We'll leave it at that. Grant, Dr. Tinsley, where can people find you?
Yeah, I have a website that has information about our research team, the equipment, students who have a lab, all that. It's just my name, granttinsley.com. That has the links to social media as well. But I'm on Instagram, Grant_Tinsley_PhD, and on Twitter, Grant Tinsley PhD with no underscores.
You heard it here, folks. And finally, the guard of the cult, the newly hired person who's going to keep out all the ruffians from the cult and protect us from all their assaults now that they know that we only look the part, but we have no bite to our bark. Jackson, where can people find you?
So feeling very inadequate that I don't have a website, but I am on Instagram as well at Jackson Pios. Pretty much anything that I'm doing with regards to research, things I'm putting in my mouth. Well, that sounded weird. Take that back. Training and things like that. That'll all go through Instagram. I'm also recently on YouTube, which is my new little hobby, and putting on, I guess, fortnightly videos that are a combination of some education combined with eating, training, and Japanese culture for any of the anime lovers out there. And for the more nerdy people who don't care for muscle or training or what I'm eating, then you can get me on ResearchGate. Just search my name as well.
Fantastic.
Jackson, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I want some anime recommendations based on the shows I've loved.
Oh,
I know you have to go to your surgery.
Now the podcast starts. Here we go.
I'm just going to throw out the two titles, Death Note and Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion, my two favorites. I need more like that, and I can't find them, but we can talk about it another time.
Yeah, oh gosh, I could speak for half now. Have you watched Naruto Shippuden? That has to be watched. That has to be watched.
I actually have not, so that's now off the list. I appreciate it.
It'll change your world.
I appreciate it.
Amazing. Well, this podcast has taken a slight turn, but I greatly appreciate it. Now, folks, if you want to check out some new anime, or if you want to watch Jackson put things in his mouth, definitely follow him on those. We'll have all of his social and all the rest of the guests' websites, the more legitimate guests who don't just have social media where they put things in their mouth, in the links below. And finally, Omar, I'm going to let you close out this monster of an episode.
Eric, it's like he's endearing us immediately. The boxing, this being the bodybuilder. Jackson, all I'll say quickly in closing is that my original weightlifting belt, I wrote on the back, Akira lives, after the Tomo Akira manga. So there's so much to discuss outside of this. Very interesting how the cult, almost like the book The Secret, Eric, we attract the right vibe just by throwing the vibe out there. We pose and then we find the right guests. Wonderful, beautiful episode. Thank you so much to everyone for participating. Their social media, all that good stuff will be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, you made it all the way to the end. I feel sorry for you, but hey, you're here. You might as well do us a favor. So now you listen to us, and this is the concept of moral reciprocity. Leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If it's not 5 stars, we take it back. Just take it easy. On YouTube, if you leave a comment, we'll do our very best to not respond. So go ahead and leave one there. We're back every single Monday from now until we appear on Joe Rogan, and then we'll announce, due to the controversy that will inevitably follow from that episode, that we're ending the Iron Cult. So until that special time, we'll see you then.